I know a lot of people have these absolute horror stories about their mother-in-laws, but honestly, mine wasn't bad at all. In fact, for the first 3 or 4 years of my marriage, my husband and I lived with her, and it was fine, you know? She had her own business, she was pretty well off, and we just stayed in our lane. There was none of that toxic dynamic you see in movies. I did my part around the house, she did hers, and we genuinely got along. But there was just this one thing. She wanted a grandchild. Desperately. My husband and I, we had been trying for a while, just working our asses off, and hoping for the best, but nothing was happening. And she wasn't mean about it, but she was definitely persistent. She'd always drop these heavy hints, sighing and saying how she just wanted a little baby to hold before she got too old. It was annoying, sure, but typical grandma stuff. But then, after about 3 years of us coming up empty, she decided to up the ante. She sat us down one night and basically put a bounty on my uterus. I'm not even kidding. She told us that business had been really good, she had a bunch of extra cash, and she made us an offer we literally couldn't refuse. She said, and I remember this so clearly, she said that if I could just get pregnant, she didn't care if it was a boy or a girl, she would build us a house, completely free and clear. She had this piece of land about 3 miles away in this area, called Long Than, which is this rapidly developing district outside the city, right? It's one of those places where they are planning a massive new airport, so property values were about to skyrocket. But at the time, it was still just a dusty town with pockets of dense neighborhoods and random stretches of overgrown nothingness. My husband was practically vibrating out of his chair. We didn't have a lot of money to our names, and the thought of having our own place, a brand new house, on a piece of land that was going to be worth a fortune, it was a no-brainer. I mean, I actually liked living with his mom. She spoiled me, but you don't say no to a free house. So, we kicked things into high gear. My husband started looking up all these weird herbal remedies, drinking this awful medicinal liquor that was supposed to boost fertility. He'd take me out for oysters constantly, and I just knew whenever we had seafood, I was not getting any sleep that night. And heck, it actually worked. About 3 or 4 months later, my period was late. I bought a cheap test from the pharmacy, peed on the stick, and boom, 2 lines. Now, any woman will tell you that a home test is only like maybe 70% accurate. You need a blood test to be sure, but my husband was so freaking excited he shoved the plastic stick right in his mom's face, and she didn't even wait for a doctor's confirmation. The very next Monday, literally the start of the week, she dragged us to the notary office and transferred the deed to the Long Than land right into our names. I stayed living at her house through my whole pregnancy. Fast forward to my 8th month. My belly is huge. I'm miserable. My back is killing me. And that's when my mother-in-law officially broke ground on our new house. She didn't mess around. She hired a massive crew to get it built fast. The night they poured the foundation, I was just waddling down the hallway to get some water, and I happened to walk past my in-laws' bedroom. The door was cracked open. Now, I am not an eavesdropper. I swear I'm not. But they were arguing, and their voices were pretty loud. I stopped because I heard my father-in-law sound really agitated, which was rare for him. I remember leaning against the wall, holding my giant stomach, as I listened to my father-in-law ask her if she was really sure about this, reminding her about the incident that happened on the empty lot directly across the street from our new property. He was saying how it was a bad idea to send me, a pregnant woman who was about to give birth, to live right across from a place where that horrible thing happened. My mother-in-law just scoffed at him. She told him he was being ridiculous, that the thing he was talking about happened over a decade ago, that the neighbors probably forgot about it, and the spirits had probably reincarnated by now. She was so dismissive, but my father-in-law kept pushing back, saying you never know with these things, that it was risky. My heart kind of dropped into my stomach. I waddled back to my room as fast as I could and waited for my husband. When he came to bed, I confronted him. I demanded to know what the hell happened on the empty lot across from our new house. He looked super uncomfortable, rubbing the back of his neck, and tried to brush it off, but I wasn't letting it go. Finally, he caved. He told me that years and years ago, a distant relative of his mom's had moved down from the countryside. They were dirt poor. His mom let them stay in her house for a bit, but the guy and his wife fought constantly, screaming matches, breaking things, so his mom kicked them out. Having nowhere to go, they borrowed some money from her and built this pathetic little tin roof shack on the empty patch of dirt right across from the plot she owned, the plot where our new house was currently being built. The wife got pregnant, but the fighting didn't stop. And one night, the husband just snapped. He beat her. He beat his pregnant wife so badly that she died right there on the dirt floor of that shack. The cops came, the guy was arrested, went to prison, and eventually, he got the death penalty. They executed him. My husband finished the story and just shrugged, telling me it was ancient history. But I was sitting there, 8 months pregnant, feeling my baby kick, and I was terrified. I begged him not to make us move. I told him we could just stay with his mom, that we had the deed to the land, and that was enough. We didn't need the house. But he completely gaslighted me, telling me I was being hormonal and irrational. He argued that we had literally nothing to our names. His mom was spending a fortune on this house. And the area was totally different now. It was packed with neighbors. The roads were paved. It wasn't the isolated dirt patch it used to be. He made me feel stupid for wanting to give up a free home over a ghost story from 10 years ago. So, I gave up. I let him convince me. I gave birth to a beautiful baby. We stayed at my mother-in-law's place for my postpartum confinement, which in our culture means you basically don't leave the room for a month to recover. By the time the baby was about 2 weeks old, the house was finished. It was incredibly fast. We didn't even have a proper housewarming, just my husband going over to light some incense, and right after the baby turned 1 month old, we packed up and moved in. For the first 5 or 6 days, it was completely fine. The house was a simple, single-story build with a nice little concrete courtyard in the front. But the view from my front door, it just unsettled me. Our side of the street was fully developed, houses packed tight against each other, but right across from us was that lot. Despite land prices in Longtan skyrocketing, no one had ever bought it. No one had ever built on it. It was just a gaping hole of overgrown weeds, twisted vines, and wild grass sitting right in the middle of a busy neighborhood. During the day, it was just an ugly eyesore. But at night, looking out my window at that pitch-black void of vegetation gave me the creeps. Then came the weekend. My husband invited a buddy of his from the city, a guy named Parker, to come down with his wife, Piper, to see the new place and have a few drinks. They were our age, early 30s, and we had hung out a few times before. Parker was a super nice guy, always cracking jokes. We set up a little table out in the front courtyard for them to drink. It was probably around 9 p.m. Actually, no, maybe closer to 9:30 because the neighborhood was starting to quiet down. I wasn't drinking because I was nursing, so I was just sitting in the living room, occasionally chatting with them through the open door while trying to keep the baby asleep. Parker had been drinking pretty heavily, and he needed to pee. Our bathroom was all the way at the back of the house, and every time he had walked past the bedroom earlier, his heavy footsteps had startled the baby. So, being considerate, he announced he was just going to cross the street and take a leak in the bushes to avoid waking my kid again. I watched him stagger across the road, but he didn't just pee on the curb. I guess he was feeling shy or something, because I watched him push his way deep into the tall grass of that overgrown, abandoned lot until the shadows completely swallowed him. Right as he disappeared into the weeds, my baby started fussing in the bedroom. You know that horrible squirming whimper right before a full meltdown? I immediately got up and went into the bedroom, which was totally dark except for the street lamp bleeding through the window. I picked up my baby, bouncing on my heels, shushing softly, trying to rock the crying away. I was standing there for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, entirely focused on getting my kid back to sleep. And then, I heard the heavy, dragging scuff of footsteps walking into the house from the courtyard, crossing the living room tile, and heading straight for my open bedroom door. I automatically assumed it was my husband coming to check on us. I didn't even turn around. I just kept bouncing the baby and whispered into the dark, telling him to go back outside, that the baby was almost asleep and his beer breath was going to ruin it. But the footsteps didn't stop. They didn't turn around. They just kept getting closer. A slow, deliberate shuffle. I spun around, annoyed, and froze. It wasn't my husband. It was Parker. He was just standing right in the doorway of my dark bedroom. I felt this immediate spike of awkwardness because, I'm a woman who just gave birth. I'm in my pajamas, holding my baby in the dark, and my husband's drunk friend is just staring at me. And his eyes, they were completely vacant. He wasn't blinking. He was just looking at me with this intense, unblinking focus that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to play it cool, offering this tight, uncomfortable smile, and I politely asked him to go back out to the courtyard, that I was just putting the baby down. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped fully into the room and walked right up to me. Because he was my husband's friend, my brain was desperately trying to rationalize it, thinking maybe he just wanted to see the baby, so I didn't scream, but every instinct in my body was screaming that this was bullshit. I backed up a step, telling him again, a little firmer this time, to please leave. But he reached out his hands, and before I could even react, he slid his arms under mine and scooped my baby right out of my chest. And the way he did it, it wasn't the clumsy, awkward way a drunk guy holds a newborn. He scooped my baby with this terrifyingly perfect, fluid motion, tucking the baby's head right into the crook of his neck, swaying his hips side to side. He was holding my kid, exactly like a mother would. I was completely paralyzed. My brain just couldn't process what I was seeing. Parker started cooing at my baby, this soft, breathy rhythm, just going, "Oh, mommy's here. Mommy's here." A jolt of absolute panic ripped through my chest. I lunged forward, reaching for my kid, my voice shaking as I told him to stop joking around and give me my baby back. But the second I stepped toward him, Parker physically recoiled. He scrambled backward, hunching his shoulders over the baby to shield it from me, turning his body away to block my hands. He kept retreating into the corner of the room, side-eyeing me with this vicious, possessive glare. I rushed him, grabbing at his shirt, practically begging him to give me my baby, and that's when he looked dead into my eyes, his voice dropping into this weird, hollow hiss, and he told me that it was his child, that the baby was his, and he kept repeating it. My child, mine. I was so terrified I couldn't even form words. I just let out this desperate, broken scream for my husband. My husband and Piper came sprinting into the room. Piper saw Parker clutching the baby and started screaming at him, asking what the hell he was doing with my kid. The distraction was just enough. Parker turned his head toward his wife, and in that split second, my husband tackled him. He grabbed the baby out of Parker's arms right as Parker seemed to just lose all the bones in his body. Parker collapsed backward, hitting the floor with a sickening thud, completely dead weight. If my husband had been a second slower, Parker would have crushed my baby underneath him. Parker lay there for maybe 10 seconds, and then he suddenly gasped, his eyes darting around wildly, shooting up to a sitting position. He had absolutely zero memory of what just happened. When we yelled at him, he started crying, swearing up and down that the last thing he remembered was zipping his pants up in the empty lot across the street. He was apologizing profusely, swearing he wasn't that drunk, promising he would never hurt a kid. We were shaken, obviously, but human beings are stupidly resilient when it comes to denying the supernatural. We all just collectively decided to blame it on the alcohol. My husband walked a highly apologetic Parker back out to the courtyard, and they actually sat back down to keep drinking. I stayed in the bedroom. There was no way in hell I was going back out there. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for about half an hour, until the baby finally fell into a deep sleep in the crib. I was just staring at the wall, my mind racing, trying to figure out how a guy I knew to be so sweet could act so utterly unhinged. As I was sitting there, I heard footsteps again. This time they were lighter, coming from the bathroom at the back of the house, moving slowly up the hallway toward my room. I looked at the frosted glass of my bedroom door and saw a silhouette stop right on the other side. I could see the outline of long hair. I let out a breath, assuming it was Piper. She had been drinking just as much as the guys, and I figured she had used the bathroom and was coming to check on me. Maybe apologize again for her husband's behavior, but she didn't knock. She just stood there. I watched her shadow against the frosted glass for a full, agonizing minute. She didn't move a single muscle. It was so incredibly weird. Finally, I couldn't take the suspense anymore. I got up, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Piper was standing right there on the threshold. Her head was tilted slightly down, her hair falling over her face. I offered her a tired smile, telling her that it was okay, that she didn't need to apologize, and that she should just go back out and enjoy the party with the guys. She didn't respond. She just kept staring at my chest. I reached out, just a casual friendly gesture, and patted her on the shoulder to reassure her. The second my hand touched her skin, a shock of pure ice shot up my arm. Her skin was freezing. It didn't feel like a living person. It felt like touching a slab of raw meat that had been left in a freezer. I pulled my hand back, a nervous laugh catching in my throat, asking if she was okay. I barely got the words out. Without any warning, without even changing her facial expression, Piper pulled her arm back and threw a closed fist punch squarely into my face. It wasn't a slap. It wasn't a girl fight. It was a heavy, bone-crushing punch with the absolute force of a grown man. The impact sounded like a wet piece of wood snapping. It threw me entirely off my feet. I crashed backward onto the hard tile floor, my vision exploding into white sparks. Before I could even try to defend myself, she was on top of me. She straddled my waist, pinning me down, and started raining punches down on my head and chest. I was a woman who had literally just given birth weeks ago. My body was broken and weak, and I was getting absolutely pummeled by this woman who suddenly had the strength of a linebacker. And she was screaming at me. But her voice, it was completely distorted, guttural, and full of this ancient boiling rage. She was cursing at me, spitting in my face, screaming that just because I was a pregnant bitch didn't mean she wouldn't beat the life out of me, screaming that she was going to kill me right there on the floor. The noise brought my husband and Parker running inside. They had to physically drag her off me, and it took both of those grown men to pull her back. Parker was screaming at her, asking what the fuck was wrong with her, why she was attacking a new mother. And just like Parker had done earlier, Piper suddenly went completely limp in their arms, her eyes rolling into the back of her head, completely unresponsive. When she came to, she was crying, confused, swearing she didn't remember anything after leaving the bathroom. At that point, the party was aggressively over. My face was throbbing, my lip was split, and I was terrified, but we lived out in the middle of nowhere. The roads were completely dark, and both Parker and Piper were too drunk to drive back to the city. We had no choice but to let them sleep it off on the living room floor, while my husband and I barricaded ourselves in the bedroom. My husband spent an hour icing my face, apologizing over and over, completely baffled by how his two best friends had seemingly lost their damn minds. We still, even then, were trying to find a logical explanation. Bad alcohol, maybe some kind of hidden drug. Around 2 a.m., I had finally drifted into this painful, exhausted doze when a frantic, violent pounding on our bedroom door jolted me awake. It was Piper. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming for my husband, begging him to come out and help her, screaming that Parker was going to kill her. My husband threw the door open, and I peeked out behind him. Out in the dimly lit living room, Parker was sitting in the middle of the floor. He was sitting completely cross-legged, his arms neatly folded across his chest. One of his legs was bouncing up and down in this rapid, manic rhythm, and he was staring right at us with this wide, sick, completely twisted smirk on his face. My husband lost his mind. He marched right up to Parker, pointing a finger in his face, screaming at him, telling him he was a piece of shit, that he had ruined the night, attacked his wife, and that their friendship was fucking over. Parker didn't flinch. He just kept bouncing his leg, smiling that horrible smile. Piper grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and she was hyperventilating, shaking her head. She whispered to me that Parker wasn't drunk. She told me that she had woken up to find him sitting on her chest, his hands wrapped around her throat, squeezing the life out of her, and she told me the exact words he had whispered to her while he was choking her. He had smiled at her and said, "I killed my own wife without blinking. You think I won't kill you too?" The moment she repeated those words to me, my blood ran completely cold. I looked past my husband, straight at Parker, and right at that exact moment, Parker's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the tile, unconscious for the third time that night. We didn't wait for him to wake up. We packed a bag in less than 3 minutes, grabbed the baby, dragged Parker and Piper into our car, and fled the house. We drove straight to my mother-in-law's place. The next morning, sitting in the safety of a brightly lit kitchen, we recounted everything to my in-laws. My father-in-law slammed his hands on the table and started yelling at my mother-in-law. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The entity that had possessed Parker first, the one that had lovingly picked up my newborn baby and claimed it as its own, was the spirit of the murdered, pregnant wife. She had died craving a child, and when she saw mine, she wanted it. But the entity that possessed Piper, the one that brutally beat me, a postpartum mother, while screaming about not caring that I had just given birth. And the entity that possessed Parker again to choke his own wife, bragging about killing his spouse, that was the abusive husband, the murderer. The energy of both of them had been festering in that empty dirt lot for over a decade, and Parker had literally unzipped his pants and stepped right into their domain. I never spent another night in that house. I absolutely refused. My mother-in-law, for all her tough businesswoman exterior, finally realized the danger she had put us in. She paid for us to stay at her house, and we put the new house up for rent. We managed to get 2 different tenants in there over the next year. Neither of them ever reported anything strange, probably because they weren't pregnant women or vulnerable new mothers, which is what clearly triggered the spirits. Eventually, we sold the property completely, took the cash, and bought a new place closer to the center of town. I've never looked back, but I still think about it. I think about how incredibly close my baby came to being crushed under a possessed man's body. I think about how fragile we are when the unseen world decides to cross the boundary. And the worst part? That piece of land, the empty lot across the street from the house we built, it is still empty today. No matter how valuable the land around it gets, no one ever clears the weeds. No one ever pours concrete. It just sits there, a dark, tangled grave waiting for the next person to wander in. If any of you listening to this have ever unknowingly brought something malicious into your home, how did you deal with the lingering anxiety? Because even years later, every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, I tense up, bracing for a punch that I know isn't coming. Anyway, I'm sorry for rambling on for so long. Thank you for listening to my story. Please, if you ever move into a new place and the locals warn you about an empty patch of dirt, don't be arrogant. Listen to them. Stay safe out there. I don't really know how to start this, to be honest. It's been over 12 years, and my chest still gets all tight just thinking about it. I was barely 13 at the time, right at that awkward age where you think you know everything, but you're actually just a dumb kid. My parents own this little business down in Da Nang, a coastal city down south where the air is constantly thick with salt, and the heat just sort of sticks to your skin all year round. But our roots, our extended family, they were all way up north in Engyeon, a province where the roads get narrower, the mountains loom over the highway, and everything just feels older and heavier. Usually, when we went back for the holidays, we'd get crammed into these miserable standard sitting buses. You know the kind? Hard seats, no legroom, smelling like cheap air freshener, and stale sweat for 15 hours straight. But this one year, business was actually booming. My dad was in a great mood, and he decided to splurge. He bought us tickets on a sleeper bus. Now, in today's world, a sleeper bus is whatever, right? You got Wi-Fi, USB ports, privacy curtains. But back then, over a decade ago, getting a ticket on one of those Moby Home buses was like flying first class. It cost them a couple million dongraf, $100 or so, which was a serious chunk of change for us at the time. I remember being so insanely hyped. I had my PSP, my PlayStation Portable, fully charged, and I was ready to just isolate myself for the whole trip. Because of how the bus was laid out, there were 3 rows of bunk beds, upper and lower. My parents were pushing 40 and didn't want to deal with climbing, so they took 2 lower bunks right next to each other. That left me on a top bunk, suspended right above them, practically sandwiched between the ceiling and the thin mattress. It felt like my own little private fortress. When we first rolled out of the terminal around noon, the 2 top bunks across the narrow aisle from me were completely empty. It was just me up there, king of the world, blasting music in my headphones and mashing buttons. I figured nobody bought those tickets. But about an hour or 2 into the drive, the driver pulled into this dusty, sun-baked rest stop. People got off to pee, grabbed some weird road snacks, stretched their legs. I didn't pay much attention until we all piled back on, and I climbed up to my bunk. That's when I noticed I had neighbors. It was a mother and her little girl. The mom looked incredibly young, maybe mid-20s, but she looked ruined. I don't know how else to describe it, like life had just chewed her up. Her shoulders were slumped, her hair was a mess, and she had a thick medical mask on, pulling a scarf over her eyes like she wanted the whole world to just disappear. The little girl was maybe 2 years old, tops, and she was fussy. I mean, relentlessly fussy. They squeezed together onto the bunk immediately to my right. But the weird thing was, they had basically bought out the 3rd bunk next to them just for their luggage, and I'm talking a mountain of crap. There was a hard-shell suitcase, a couple of heavy plastic bags, a bulky diaper bag, and sitting right at the front of the pile was this large, rigid backpack. It had this faded, military-style camo print, not actual army issue, just that cheap stuff you buy at local street markets, and it looked heavy. I just sort of watched them settle in. The little girl kept whining, babbling, doing that annoying toddler thing, and I just gave her a goofy smile, trying to be nice, before putting my headphones back on. For the next 5 or 6 hours, nothing happened. We were just cruising up Highway 1, the tires humming against the asphalt, the whole bus swaying gently. It was mind-numbingly boring, the kind of white noise that just puts you into a trance. It wasn't until around, I don't know, maybe 5:30 or 6 p.m. when things started getting weird. The sun was dipping down, painting the sky this bruised purple color, and the interior of the bus was getting dim and shadowy because the driver hadn't turned the overhead lights on yet. I was half asleep, the PSP resting on my chest, when the toddler started acting up again. She wasn't just whining this time. She was practically climbing over her mom's stomach, smacking her mom's arms, and pointing frantically across the aisle at the bunk piled high with luggage. And I heard her clearly say, over the low rumble of the engine, she kept saying, "Dada, Dada, Dada." Her mom groaned. It was this gut-wrenching, exhausted sound. I remember hearing the mom desperately trying to shush the kid, her voice cracking as she told her that Dada was resting, that Dada couldn't play right now, and that she just needed to wait until they got to Grandma's house. I was lying there, trying not to eavesdrop, but my brain was doing mental gymnastics. I was like, okay, maybe the dad couldn't get a ticket on this bus and he's taking a different one, or maybe they're divorced, but why is she pointing at a pile of bags? I just chalked it up to kids being stupid and having imaginary friends. So, I rolled over, facing the window, watching the dark trees blur past, and then I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, but it cut through the hum of the AC and the rumble of the tires so clearly that my blood instantly felt like it dropped 10 degrees. It was a cough, but it was this wet, rattling, deep-chested cough of a grown man, and it sounded like it came from directly behind my head, from the other side of the aisle. The silence that hung in the air after that cough was absolutely suffocating until I slowly forced myself to turn my head and look over my shoulder, my eyes straining in the dim, grayish light of the cabin, and I swear to God my heart completely stopped in my chest. There was a man lying on the luggage bunk. Where the suitcase and the camo backpack had been just seconds ago, there was now a full-grown man lying flat on his back. He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s. I couldn't make out all his features because of the shadows, but I could clearly see he had this thick, dark mustache resting right above his upper lip. But the thing that made my stomach tie into knots, the thing that made my breath catch in my throat, was the way he was lying. He was perfectly, unnaturally straight. His legs were pinned together, and his hands were folded neatly over his stomach, resting right on his belly button. His head was turned just slightly toward the ceiling. He wasn't breathing, or at least his chest wasn't moving. Look, I know how this sounds. You're probably thinking I was just hallucinating, right? The AC was blowing in my face. I was drowsy. I was a kid. I literally tried to tell myself that. I squeezed my eyes shut, my brain scrambling for any logical excuse, telling myself that the driver must have pulled over to pick up a random drifter off the side of the highway, which they sometimes did to make extra cash, and that the mom just moved her bags to the floor. Yeah, that had to be it. I kept my eyes squeezed shut for maybe 20 seconds, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then I slowly opened them again. The man was gone. The bunk was entirely empty except for the suitcase, the plastic bags, and that heavy camo backpack sitting exactly where it had been before. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, wiping cold sweat off my forehead, mentally calling myself an idiot. But then I looked over at the little girl. She was sitting up, staring right at me, and she smiled, this big, innocent, toothy smile. Then she raised her chubby little finger, pointed directly at the camo backpack, and babbled, "Dada, Dada." I felt nauseous. I remember trying to play it off, forcing a nervous laugh, quietly whispering back to her, asking her where her dad was, hoping she'd point out the window or something. But she just kept pointing at the bag. Her mom finally snapped out of her sleep, pulling her mask down, her eyes completely swollen and red, barking at the kid to leave her dad alone, telling her that he was resting in there and they'd be home soon. I completely froze. I didn't touch my PSP for the rest of the evening. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling this heavy, oppressive energy pressing down on my chest. By the time it was fully dark outside, maybe around 7 p.m., the bus lurched and slowed down, pulling into a massive, brightly lit rest stop. The fluorescent lights from the food stalls outside flooded the cabin. The rule on these sleeper buses was that the bottom bunks got off first, then the top bunks. My parents called up to me, telling me to stay put and wait for the aisle to clear before I climbed down, and I just mumbled that I would. I sat up on my mattress, packing my headphones into my bag, watching the mom and her toddler climb down and shuffle off the bus. The cabin was emptying out fast. I swung my legs over the edge of the bunk, ready to climb down the little metal ladder. I casually glanced over my shoulder one last time, and he was there again. I couldn't breathe. My throat completely closed up. The harsh neon light from the rest stop was slicing right through the bus window, illuminating him perfectly. The mustache, the pale, waxy skin. But he wasn't lying flat on his back anymore. He was lying on his side, his head propped up on his hand, completely ignoring gravity, just occupying the exact space where the luggage was supposed to be. His eyes were open, but they were so dead, so incredibly empty and hollow, staring blankly ahead, like he was just waiting to go home. I scrambled down that ladder so fast I scraped all the skin off my shin, basically throwing myself down the aisle and out the front door. The driver was stepping out behind me, clicking his keys to lock up. I grabbed his shirt, practically hyperventilating, desperately trying to tell him that someone was still up there, that a man was still on the top bunk. The driver just looked at me like I was insane, smacking my hand away, telling me to quit screwing around, that he just checked the back and the bus was empty. My parents dragged me away to the food stalls, scolding me for bothering the driver. I couldn't eat. I couldn't even drink water. My hands were shaking so violently I had to sit on them. After about 10 minutes of pacing around, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to prove to myself that I was just seeing things. I walked away from the food stalls and crept back toward the parked bus. I stood on the dirty concrete, looking up at the massive side window of the bus, trying to locate where my bunk was. When I found it, my stomach completely dropped out of my body. Looking out from the top window, pressed right against the glass, was a hand. And then, a face slowly leaned into the light. It was him. He was lying on his side, his head tilted at this awful, unnatural angle, peering down through the glass directly at me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He just had this look of unbearable, suffocating sadness. We just stared at each other. Me on the pavement. Him, trapped behind the glass of a locked, empty bus. I don't know how long I stood there paralyzed, but the sudden, violent roar of the bus engine starting up completely shattered the trance. I violently flinched, blinking hard, and when I looked back up, nothing. Just the camo backpack, its straps pressing against the window right where his face had been. I felt like I was losing my freaking mind. When we all filed back onto the bus, I was a wreck. The mother and toddler stopped by the driver, and I overheard the mom, her voice trembling, asking how far away the next gas station in Vin was. The driver told her it was about 20 minutes away. She thanked him, saying her in-laws were waiting there. She climbed up to her bunk, and I practically crawled into mine, pressing my back so hard against the wall I thought I'd break through the fiberglass. About 5 minutes into the drive, the cabin was dead silent again. The little girl was playing with some plastic toy on the floorboards. And then, the mom started crying. But it wasn't the exhausted sobbing from before. It was this agonizing, soul-crushing weeping. I forced myself to peek over the edge of my blanket. She had the camo backpack resting in her lap. She had unzipped the top just a few inches, and her hands were reaching inside, gently stroking something smooth and hard. Through her tears, in this broken, desperate whisper, she kept saying, "We're almost there, honey. We're almost to your mom's house. We're almost home." She was talking to the bag. She was stroking the inside of the bag like she was holding her husband's face. She suddenly looked up, catching me staring at her. Her eyes flared with this fierce, defensive anger. She violently zipped the bag shut, clutching it to her chest, glaring at me, until I completely buried my head under my blanket, squeezing my eyes shut so hard I saw stars. 20 minutes later, the air brakes hissed, and we pulled into a brightly lit, massive gas station in Vin. The driver yelled out the location. The mom, struggling under the weight of the camo backpack, carried her toddler down the aisle. A few other passengers were getting off too, so the bus assistant hopped out to open the luggage compartments underneath. I stayed in my bunk, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window, looking down at the pavement. There was a massive group of people waiting by the gas pumps, maybe 10 or 15 people, grandparents, uncles, aunts. The moment the young mom stepped off the bus, her legs just gave out. She completely collapsed, sobbing hysterically, falling into the arms of an old woman with snow-white hair who was wailing so loudly I could hear it through the sealed windows. The old woman kept screaming, "Where is my son? Where is my boy?" Someone took the toddler. Someone else gently pulled the heavy camo backpack from the weeping widow's shoulders. They placed the backpack on the ground and slowly unzipped it. I pressed my face against the glass, my breath fogging up the window. An uncle reached his hands in and carefully pulled out a heavy porcelain urn. It was shaped almost like a lotus bud, pristine and white. I had never seen a cremation urn before. I didn't really process what it was at first, but then the uncle turned it around, facing the family, and the harsh overhead lights of the gas station hit the small, circular ceramic photo glued to the front of the urn. I stopped breathing. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. It was a standard passport-style photo. A man in a sharp suit and a tie, with a thick, dark mustache. It was him, the exact same face, the exact same dead, sad eyes that had been staring at me through the window not an hour ago. The whole family broke down, dropping to their knees on the dirty concrete, reaching out to touch the cold porcelain, weeping over the ashes of the man they had lost. The bus assistant quickly slammed the luggage doors shut and banged on the side of the bus. The driver threw it in gear, and we slowly began to roll forward. As the bus pulled away, I kept my eyes glued to the mourning family, my entire body trembling so hard my teeth were chattering. And as the bus cleared the gas pumps, revealing the dark stretch of pavement, just beyond the lights, I saw him, standing about 10 feet away from his own grieving family, completely separated from the warmth of the living. He wasn't wearing the suit from the photo. He was wearing the same faded clothes I had seen him in on the bunk. He had his hands clasped behind his back, standing perfectly still, his head tilted at that awful, unnatural angle, just watching his wife cry over his own ashes. He slowly turned his head, and he looked directly up at my window as the bus drove past. I absolutely lost my fucking mind. I scrambled backwards so violently that I launched myself right off the edge of the top bunk. I hit the metal railing, flipped over, and crashed hard onto the floor of the narrow aisle. I didn't even feel the pain. I just started screaming. I was thrashing on the dirty floorboards, hyperventilating, screaming for my mom, screaming that there was a ghost, screaming until my lungs felt like they were bleeding. The whole bus erupted into chaos. The driver was yelling, passengers were swearing, and my mom was practically dragging me under her bottom bunk, holding my head to her chest while I sobbed uncontrollably. When I finally caught my breath enough to choke out what I saw, the passengers around us just fell dead silent. I remember an older woman sitting a few rows up, just softly clapping her hands in prayer, whispering how the husband's soul was so strong, how he had tied his spirit to the urn so he could ride the bus back to his hometown, watching over his wife and kid the whole way. My parents tried to comfort me. They said he was just a sad spirit trying to get home, that he meant no harm, that it was actually a beautiful thing. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was beautiful in some twisted, tragic way. But I didn't sleep a single wink for the rest of that trip. I refused to go back to the top bunk. I wedged myself against the wall next to my mom, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, unable to shake the image of his dead eyes staring at me. It's been over a decade, and my parents have their own car now, so we never take the bus anymore. But every single time we drive up Highway 1 for the holidays, every time we pass that specific gas station in Vin, my throat closes up. I always look out the window into the shadows near the pumps, bracing myself, because my mind always goes to this dark, terrifying place. What if he didn't get off the bus? They took the urn, yeah, but what if his spirit didn't know he was supposed to leave? What if he's still riding that same route, lying perfectly straight on the top bunk, waiting for his wife to open the bag and tell him they're home? I don't ride sleeper buses anymore. I gotta be honest with you. Most people who have paranormal experiences will tell you it happens randomly. A weird noise in a new apartment, a shadow on a dark road. But for me, it's not random at all. It's medical. I'm in my early 30s now, living a pretty quiet life. But for the longest time, I had this condition. You see, I don't see ghosts when I'm healthy. If I'm eating right, working hard, and my immune system is strong, I'm just like everybody else. The world is normal. But the moment my body breaks down, if I catch a bad flu, if my fever spikes, if I'm physically exhausted and my vitality drops, that's when the veil tears open. And the kicker is, I don't see scary old men, or women in white dresses, or demons. I only ever see kids, child spirits. For some reason, when my temperature hits 101, I become a beacon for them. To explain why this happens, I gotta take you back to when I was about 7 or 8 years old, growing up deep in the Mekong Delta. If you don't know the Delta, you need to understand that water is everything there. We lived right on a massive winding river system. As a kid, the river was our playground. My dad taught me how to swim when I was barely out of diapers, and by the time I was in first grade, I was basically amphibious. Every single day after school, I'd drop my backpack in the dirt and sprint for the water. I didn't care if it was a small irrigation ditch, a murky catfish pond, or the main river. If it was wet, I was jumping in. I was obsessed. My friends liked swimming, sure, but their parents would beat them with a bamboo switch if they stayed out too late. So, a lot of times, they'd bail on me. One afternoon, I couldn't get anyone to come with me. They were all too scared of getting in trouble. I figured, fine, I'll just go by myself. Now, a smart kid would have gone to a shallow creek. I went straight to the main river. It was wide, the water was a deep, muddy brown, and the current was deceptively strong. I dove off the wooden pier and started swimming out. When you're a kid swimming alone, you have to invent games to keep yourself entertained. My favorite game was racing the debris. I'd spot a clump of water hyacinths floating down the river, and I'd try to intercept it before the current carried it past my invisible finish line. I saw a big patch of green floating way out toward the middle of the river. I put my head down and paddled as hard as I could. I actually managed to grab it, feeling pretty proud of myself. But when I turned around to head back, I realized I had drifted much further than I thought. The wooden pier looked incredibly small. I was easily 40 yards out. I started swimming back, but I was already tired. Just then, a large motorized wooden cargo boat came chugging down the center of the river. The driver wasn't paying attention to some kid in the water. The boat kicked up a massive wake. The first wave hit me hard, washing over my head and pushing me off course. I swallowed a mouthful of muddy water and panicked. I kicked my legs out to tread water, trying to catch my breath. That's when my right foot hit something solid under the surface. It was a submerged, dead tree branch. It was shaped like a massive Y, and my ankle slid perfectly into the narrow notch of the wood. The current shifted, pulling my body one way, while my foot was pinned completely still. It violently twisted my ankle. The pain was blinding. I tried to reach down to free myself, but the next wave from the boat crashed directly over my face. I couldn't float. I was anchored to the bottom. Every time I opened my mouth to scream, the river just poured in. I remember the frantic burning sensation in my chest, the thrashing of my arms, and then just a heavy, dark silence. I blacked out. I was clinically dead. Long story short, a neighbor happened to be walking by the bank a minute later. He saw just the top of my head bobbing under the waves. He dove in, yanked my foot out of the branch, and dragged me to the mud bank. I don't know how long I wasn't breathing, but he had to flip me over his shoulder and literally bounce the water out of my lungs until I finally threw up and gasped for air. My ankle was swollen and purple, but I was alive. I limped home and lied to my parents, telling them I hurt my leg playing soccer. I was terrified they'd ban me from the water forever. I stayed away from the main river for about 3 months, but eventually the fear faded and the addiction came back. It was late afternoon, maybe around 5:30. Again, nobody wanted to swim with me, so I went back to the exact same wooden pier. I jumped in and swam around for over an hour. The sun started to set, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. The water grew cold. I figured it was time to head in before my dad came looking for me. I swam over to the wooden pier, intending to grab the slick wooden posts and pull myself up. But as I got close, I looked up at the bank. There was a crowd standing there. It was a massive group of children, maybe 15 or 16 of them. In a rural village, you know every single kid by name. You know their faces, their voices, their parents. I had never seen any of these kids in my life, and they looked wrong. It was a completely chaotic mix. Some had shaved heads, some had wild matted hair, some were wearing modern t-shirts, others were in ragged loincloths, and a few were completely naked. Some looked like toddlers, others looked about my age. They weren't talking, they weren't laughing, they were just lining up on the edge of the pier. And then, the first kid just stepped forward and jumped right into the river with a heavy, muffled splash that sounded completely wrong. Immediately followed by the second kid stepping up and hitting the water with that exact same sickeningly hollow splash, and then the third kid did the exact same thing, without a single second of hesitation. I was treading water right next to the pier, holding onto a wooden post. The water from their splashes was hitting my face. I was just staring at them, completely confused. I couldn't climb up because they were blocking the ladder. I weakly called out, begging them to just let me up, but they completely ignored me and just kept jumping into the freezing water, creating this endless, agonizing rhythm of hollow splashes that kept echoing in the dark. After a few minutes, the water was freezing and my arms were shaking. I looked closely at the line of kids, and my heart stopped. The first kid who had jumped, a boy with a distinct bald spot, was back at the front of the line. He stepped off the edge and jumped again. I looked at the water around me. Nobody had surfaced. 16 kids had jumped into the deep river right next to me, and not a single one had come back up for air. They were just sinking like stones, but somehow they were seamlessly walking out of the tall grass on the bank, getting back in line, and jumping again. It was a flawless, silent loop, an endless conveyor belt of drowning children. I realized I couldn't hear their footsteps on the wooden boards. I could only hear the splash, and even that sounded muffled, like it was happening underwater. I was trapped in the freezing river, clinging to the post, watching dead kids recreate their final moments over and over again. I absolutely lost it. I started screaming and crying at the top of my lungs. Suddenly, a rough hand grabbed my shoulder. A raspy voice angrily demanded to know what the hell I was doing down there. I jerked my head up. The line of children was instantly gone. The pier was empty, except for an old woman from my neighborhood wearing a conical hat. She reached down, grabbed my arm, and hauled me up onto the wooden planks. She aggressively scolded me, asking if I was completely crazy, because absolutely nobody swims in the main river at dusk unless they actively want the water spirits to drag them down. I just sat there, shivering uncontrollably, staring at the dark, swirling water. I went home and finally confessed everything to my mom, the near drowning months ago, and what I just saw. She turned pale. She told me that because I had technically died in that water, my spirit was permanently marked. Those kids hadn't come to hurt me. They had sensed someone who belonged with them, and they were waiting for me to come back. You'd think an experience like that would make me cautious, but I was a stubborn kid. Fast forward a few years. I was 14. I absolutely hated school, so I dropped out in the 8th grade. Back then, in the countryside, there were these sketchy, unregulated family-run businesses that produced cheap knockoff soda. They'd hire local teenagers for pennies to do the grunt work. I needed money for the internet cafe to play online RPGs, so I took a job at a bottling shed. My job was mind-numbingly simple. I sat on a tiny plastic stool on a wet concrete floor. Beside me was a stack of dirty plastic crates filled with empty, sticky glass bottles returned from local shops. I had to take each bottle, shove a soapy brush inside, scrub it, rinse it, and place it into a clean crate on my other side. We didn't get an hourly wage. We got paid by the crate. It equated to roughly 50 Vietnamese dong per bottle. To give you an idea, you had to wash 20 bottles just to buy a single piece of cheap candy. Most kids quit after 3 days because their hands would peel from the harsh chemicals. But I was desperate to level up my online character, so I stayed. Because everyone else quit, I had to take on massive loads. Sometimes I'd sit there from 3 in the afternoon until 9 at night, just scrubbing glass in the dark. One evening, I was feeling terrible. My throat was on fire, my joints ached, and I had a throbbing headache. I was definitely running a high fever, but my pockets were empty, and I needed the cash. I figured I'd just push through it for a few hours. By 7 o'clock, the main production crew had gone home. It was just me, sitting in this isolated, dimly lit corner of the open-air shed. The only sound was the running water from my hose and the squeak of my brush. I was burning up. Sweat was dripping off my nose, and my vision was getting blurry. I had just finished washing a full crate, 24 bottles, perfectly arranged in their slots. I slid the clean crate to my right and reached to my left for another dirty one. When I turned back, my stomach dropped. The clean crate I had just finished was empty. I blinked, rubbing my hot, sweaty eyes. I looked down. All 24 bottles were scattered across the filthy, wet concrete floor. They were covered in soapy mud and dead bugs. I let out a frustrated groan. I told myself I must have been so delirious from the fever that I accidentally knocked the crate over without realizing it. Cursing under my breath, I got off my stool, picked up all 24 bottles, and painstakingly washed them a second time. I put them back in the crate, double-checked that it was secure, and grabbed a new batch. 5 minutes later, I heard a soft clink. I looked over. The bottles were on the floor again. A cold sweat broke out over my feverish skin. The air in the shed suddenly felt suffocatingly dense. My ears started ringing. I realized there was no physical way those bottles could have jumped out of the crate. I couldn't do it anymore. The fever and the fear were too much. I decided to pack it in and go collect my measly pay. I stood up, taking a deep breath to steady myself. But as soon as I took a step, the shed spun violently. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the wet concrete. I didn't completely black out, but I was severely dazed. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to push myself up. As my vision cleared, I looked down the long, empty aisle of the shed. There were 4 children standing there. They weren't the same kids from the river, but they had the same unnatural, mismatched appearance. One had long, unkempt hair, tied with a dirty rag. The others were boys in oversized, soiled clothes. They were staring right at me, and they were smiling. Wide, silent, excited smiles. They weren't just standing there, though. Each of them had their hands gripping the edge of a plastic crate loaded with heavy glass bottles. If you grew up around those crates, you know they make a very specific, deafening sound when you drag them across rough concrete. It sounded exactly like a derailed train, just this deafening clink-clank, clink-clank, clink-clank noise that practically shook my teeth. The 4 kids crouched down, still smiling that unnerving smile, and started pushing the heavy crates across the floor, directly toward me. They were treating them like toy cars, racing them. The sound was just unbearable. That scraping plastic and violent rattling of the glass echoing off the tin roof of the shed, growing louder and louder as they ran toward me, and I just remember my brain screaming, "Oh fuck, oh sweet fucking God," because I was paralyzed on the floor, too weak from the fever to even crawl away. I just covered my head with my arms. I saw the front wheels of the plastic crates right in front of my face, and then it all ended in this absolutely deafening, explosive crash of shattering glass that literally felt like a bomb going off inside my skull. Thousands of shards exploded into the air. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the heavy crates to crush my ribs, waiting for the glass to tear my face apart. I passed out. I woke up to someone kicking my leg. It was the owner of the facility. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, veins bulging in her neck. I slowly sat up, my head pounding. I looked around. The ghost kids were gone, but the destruction was very real. Around my body, 5 entire crates of bottles were completely obliterated, smashed into dust and sharp fragments. Amazingly, none of the glass had seriously cut me, just a few superficial scratches on my arms. The owner was shrieking at the top of her lungs, screaming about what the hell was wrong with me and accusing me of breaking 100 bottles just because I was throwing a tantrum, swearing that I was going to pay for every single one of them. I tried to explain. I told her I saw kids in the shed. I told her they pushed the crates. She looked at me like I was insane. It was 8 p.m. The gates were locked. No neighborhood kids were in there. She dragged me home by my ear and demanded compensation from my parents. The fine was astronomical for us. It wiped out weeks of my dad's wages. My dad was furious, ready to beat me black and blue, but my mom stopped him. She looked at my flushed face, felt my burning forehead, and saw the terrified look in my eyes. She remembered the river. She realized the pattern before I did. She quietly explained to my dad that I was sick, and that whenever my body was weak, my spirit became weak too, opening a door for them to come out and play with me. I never went back to that bottling shed. In fact, I never worked a night shift again. It's been over 15 years, and I've learned to manage it. But it requires absolute paranoia. The second I feel a tickle in my throat, the moment my muscles ache, I lock myself in my bedroom. I take fever reducers religiously. I refuse to be alone in a dimly lit room when my immune system is fighting something, because I know that if my temperature gets high enough, the door will open again, and I really don't want to see what kind of games the little wanderers want to play next. I don't go to the beach anymore. People think I'm crazy, especially living here where the coast is supposed to be this huge getaway, but I just can't do it. It's not the water I'm afraid of. It's the sand, the way it gets absolutely everywhere, grinding into the floorboards, sticking to your skin, trapping the heat and the smell of the ocean. Most of all, I hate the cheap, run-down accommodations you find scattered along the older coastal roads. The places that feel like they were built on top of something that was already there, something that didn't want to be paved over. Back when I was in the 11th grade, I lived in Binduong. It's this massive industrial hub, heavily packed with factories, exhaust fumes, and an endless sea of motorbikes. For us kids, a school trip was the ultimate escape. That year, our high school organized a massive getaway to Phan Thit, a coastal town a few hours away. When I say massive, I mean it. We had 3 entire grades going, 10th, 11th, and 12th. We were talking about easily over 1,000 teenagers. I remember showing up at the school gates at 4 in the morning, and the line of 50-seater buses stretched for over a mile down the dusty road. Because there were so many of us, the school had to be incredibly cheap and practical about where we stayed. We didn't get to stay in the heart of Phan Thit, or those fancy tourist strips with the luxury pools. Instead, they booked us into this long stretch of budget resorts right off the coastal highway. These places were barely 3 stars, probably costing the school no more than $15 or $20 a head per night. They were small, maybe 30 rooms each, so the school had to rent out 3 or 4 adjacent resorts just to fit everyone. The 10th graders got Resort A, my grade got Resort B, and the seniors were in Resort C. But because my grade was so huge, like 15 different classes, a few of our groups got separated and had to stay over in Resort A with the younger kids. Now, if you've ever stayed in these cheap, clustered resorts, you know how they handle property lines. Sometimes it's a concrete wall, sometimes it's a nice hedge, but often, if they want to save money, they just leave a patch of dead land between the buildings. Between Resort A and Resort B, there was this gap. It was maybe 10 or 15 feet wide. It wasn't a garden. It was just a shallow, overgrown ditch filled with dry, dead palm leaves, twisted roots, and trash. Guests from both sides would just casually toss their empty bottles and snack wrappers into it. It was a filthy, neglected blind spot. And that is exactly where the thing was living. Once we unpacked, the chaos started. You know how teenagers are. We didn't stay in our assigned rooms. We were constantly running back and forth between the resorts to borrow phone chargers, steal snacks, or just gossip. To get from Resort B to Resort A, you had 2 choices. The official way was to walk all the way down to the public beach, trudge through the deep sand for a bit, and then walk up the steps into the other resort. It was a hassle. Your shoes would get full of wet sand. The second choice was the shortcut. You just squeezed through a gap in the fence and hopped directly over that trash-filled ditch. It wasn't meant for walking. You had to step on crunchy leaves and avoid rusty cans, but it took 5 seconds. So, naturally, we took the shortcut. We must have crossed that ditch 24 times by mid-afternoon. I was hanging out with a tight group of girls, and one of them was Na. Na was a bit different from the rest of us. She was of Khmer descent, originally from the deep rural south, down in the Mekong Delta, before her parents moved up to the industrial zones for factory work. She was great, super loud when she was happy, but she had this other side to her. Her family had deep roots in spiritual practices. Her uncle back in her hometown was an actual shaman, not a scam artist reading palms for tourists, but a guy people went to when modern medicine completely failed and things got dark. It was around 2 in the afternoon. The sun was absolutely blistering. You could see the heat radiating off the pavement. I was practically jogging across the shortcut, sweating my crap out, and holding my hand over my forehead to block the UV rays, complaining about getting a sunburn. But right behind me, Na stopped dead in her tracks in the middle of that ditch. I turned around, annoyed. I told her to hurry up before we melted. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking down at the dead leaves and the plastic wrappers. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, in 100-degree weather. I walked back and grabbed her arm to pull her along, and I swear to God, her skin was like ice. She had these massive goosebumps popping up all over her arms. It felt like grabbing a carton of milk right out of the fridge. She whispered, her teeth actually chattering a little bit, asking why it was so freezing right there. I just laughed it off. I told her the shade from the buildings was trapping the AC exhaust from the hotel rooms or something stupid like that. The human brain is incredibly good at making up logical excuses when faced with something utterly wrong. We walked back to our room, but for the rest of the day, whenever we had to cross, Na refused to take the shortcut. She willingly walked the long way around through the hot sand. She said that patch of dirt felt heavy, like walking through deep water. Late that afternoon, the sun started to dip, casting these long, jagged shadows across the sand. The school organized a massive team-building event on the public beach. Hundreds of kids screaming, playing tug-of-war, kicking soccer balls. Pure noise. Over in the 10th grade section, there was this kid named Bo. Bo was the easiest target for bullying in the entire school. He was tiny, incredibly frail, and wore these thick glasses. He honestly looked like a middle schooler who had wandered onto our campus by mistake. He spent half the school year resting in the nurse's office because his constitution was so weak. While everyone was screaming and pulling on ropes, I noticed Bo standing completely apart from his class. He was standing on the edge of the beach, right where the sand met that overgrown ditch between the resorts. He wasn't participating. He wasn't even watching the games. He was just staring into the ditch, with his hands clasped behind his back like an old man. A teacher with a megaphone walked over to him, probably telling him to join the games. From a distance, I saw Bo lean in and whisper something into the teacher's ear. The teacher looked confused, glanced into the empty, trash-filled ditch, then tapped Bo on the head and walked away, dismissing him. I pointed him out to Na and a few others. We figured he was just trying to get out of doing physical activity. But a few minutes later, one of our friends screamed. Bo had collapsed. He didn't just fall over. He dropped like a sack of wet cement right into the sand. The 10th grade teachers rushed over and propped him up. We watched from a distance, assuming it was just heat stroke. He was a frail kid, it made sense. But when they got him on his feet, he didn't look woozy or dizzy. He looked dead behind the eyes. His face was a sickly, pale gray. He didn't speak a single word to the teachers. He just started obsessively brushing the sand off his clothes with this weird, frantic energy. The teacher patted his shoulder and told him to go back to his room to rest. Bo just turned mechanically and walked away, his head twitching slightly to the side. We thought that was the end of it. We went back to playing. About an hour later, the sun had almost fully set. The sky was that bruised purple color you only get near the ocean. 2 girls from our group, who were staying in the rooms right next to the ditch, ran back to grab their phones to take pictures of the sunset. I waited for them on the beach. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Suddenly, they came sprinting out of the resort, their faces completely drained of color. They weren't holding their phones. They were shaking so hard they could barely speak. I asked them what the freaking hell was wrong. One of them, stuttering, told me that they had gone into their room and were fixing their makeup in the mirror. Their room had a window that looked directly out into the hallway, which bordered that ditch. While they were looking in the mirror, they saw a reflection in the glass. Bo was standing right outside their window. They thought he was just being a creep, wandering around the resort instead of resting. But when they turned around and opened the door to yell at him, they froze. Bo wasn't standing like a teenage boy. He was standing with one hand heavily planted on his hip, his back arched, the other hand delicately touching a decorative potted plant. His posture was deeply, disturbingly feminine, and I don't mean just flamboyant. It was the heavy, tired posture of a middle-aged woman. The girls, trying to mask their fear with high school cruelty, started mocking him. They asked him if he was finally coming out of the closet, making fun of his pose. Bo slowly turned his head. He didn't move his body, just his neck, snapping it to the side to glare at them out of the corner of his eye. The girls said his eyes didn't look right. They were too wide, completely devoid of any light. Then, he took a step toward them. He moved with this swaying, heavy gait. He raised his hand, pointing a finger right at their faces, and spoke. But it wasn't Bo's voice. It was a sharp, grating, high-pitched voice, dripping with venom. It was the voice of a bitter, older woman. The voice hissed from the boy's mouth, calling them little brats, and demanding to know if they had any idea how old she was. She spat that they were not peers, threatening to snap their little necks right there if they didn't show some respect. He threatened them with a completely straight, deadpan face, but the voice was rising in hysteria. Then, he simply turned around and walked away, doing this bizarre, hip-swaying strut, reaching up to run a hand through his hair, except Bo had a buzz cut, so his hand was just floating in the air, mimicking the motion of tossing long hair over a shoulder. When the girls told us this on the beach, most of the group laughed. They thought Bo was having a mental breakdown, or just doing a really screwed-up bit to scare them back for bullying him. But Na didn't laugh. She pulled me aside while the others were walking toward the seafood restaurant for dinner. She whispered frantically, looking back toward the resorts, swearing to me that it wasn't a joke, that he didn't make that up and definitely wasn't acting. I rolled my eyes. I told her to stop being so dramatic. She grabbed my wrist with a tight, sweaty grip, insisting I didn't get it. She reminded me how cold she got when we crossed that ditch and how he was staring right into that exact same spot before he passed out. She told me something old was in there, and it grabbed him because his energy was so weak, literally wearing him like a suit. Jesus, hearing her say it like that, so matter-of-factly, sent a chill straight down my spine. But teenagers are stupid. When we got to the dinner tables, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. I told the whole group what Na said. I told them Na's uncle was a shaman, and that she thought Bo was possessed by a ghost from the ditch. The entire table erupted in laughter. They mocked Na relentlessly. Even the two girls who had been terrified moments ago joined in, relieved to have a logical excuse to dismiss their fear. They called Na a superstitious hillbilly. Na's face flushed red with humiliation and anger. You have to understand, she had grown up around this stuff. To her, it was as real as gravity. Being mocked by a bunch of ignorant city kids pushed her over the edge. She slammed her hands on the table, challenging anyone brave enough who didn't believe her to come to her room that night. She promised she would prove it and make the thing show itself, since her window faced that ditch. The table went quiet for a second, then a few girls nervously agreed, purely out of spite. While we were eating, I saw Na quietly taking pieces of sliced pork, boiled chicken, and some fruit, wrapping them up in a plastic bag. I asked her what she was doing. She looked at me with this deadly serious expression. She quietly explained that if you open a door to call something out, you absolutely have to pay the toll and feed it, otherwise it gets incredibly pissed off, and this was her offering. But things rarely go as planned. After dinner, the teachers forced the entire school into a massive, stuffy conference hall for a mandatory assembly. It was an hour of boring speeches about school pride and safety. By the time we were finally released back to our rooms, everyone was exhausted. In the rush to leave the hall, Na left the plastic bag of food sitting under her chair. Nobody remembered it. By 10 o'clock, the bravado had worn off. Only 3 girls actually showed up to our room to see Na's proof, so it was just the 4 of us. The room was illuminated by a single, dim bedside lamp. Na ordered us to turn off the air conditioning. She went to the window, closed the heavy glass panels, and pulled the sheer white curtains shut. The room immediately became an oven. The air was thick, stagnant, and completely devoid of any breeze. Na commanded us to stand back. We huddled on the far bed, nervously giggling, but honestly, the vibe in the room was suffocating. Na stood about 6 feet away from the window. She closed her eyes, clasped her hands together, and started to whisper. She was speaking entirely in Khmer. It was a rhythmic, rising and falling chant. It sounded like a negotiation, a plea mixed with a command. She was using the formula she had heard her uncle use 100 times. She gave a fake title, claimed she was the disciple of a powerful master, and invited whatever was dwelling in the dirt outside to make its presence known. For 2 straight minutes, nothing happened, just the sound of her whispering and our heavy breathing in the hot room. Then, she stopped. She opened her eyes and pointed a trembling finger at the window. She breathed out a warning for us to look. The sheer white curtain was moving. There was absolutely no draft in the room. The AC was dead, but the fabric was rippling, very slowly, as if someone was gently exhaling against it from the other side. One of the girls scoffed nervously, telling Na to cut the bullshit and rationalizing that it was just the heat making the air rise. Na's jaw clenched. She was deeply offended. She turned back to the window, raised her voice, and switched to Vietnamese so we could understand. She commanded it, her voice shaking but forceful, demanding that if it was really there, it needed to give us a real sign and show everyone its presence. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a breeze. It was a violent, physical force. Both sides of the heavy curtains were grabbed and violently ripped apart. The sound of the metal rings screeching across the curtain rod, screech, clack, echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The curtains were pinned back against the walls, exposing the dark glass of the window. We screamed. It wasn't a movie scream. It was that ugly, guttural sound you make when your brain simply cannot process what your eyes are seeing. We scrambled off the bed, tripping over each other, and bolted out the door into the outdoor corridor. We stood in the humid night air, clutching each other, crying. Na ran out right behind us, looking completely terrified of her own success. She cried out, hysterically asking if we believed her now, and screaming that she had told us so. I grabbed her shoulders, frantically agreeing that we believed her while begging her to make it go away and send it back. Na's face suddenly dropped. All the adrenaline drained out of her, replaced by a look of absolute horror. She started patting her pockets, looking around wildly. She gasped in panic, asking where the food was. My stomach plummeted. We had left it in the conference hall. The hall was locked. The kitchens were closed. We were in a cheap resort in the middle of nowhere. There were no vending machines, no minibars in the rooms. We had absolutely nothing to offer. I asked her, my voice barely a squeak, what would happen if we didn't feed it? She stammered that she didn't know, tears welling up in her eyes, muttering that her uncle always gave them something before telling them to leave. We were too terrified to go sleep in the other rooms alone. We forced ourselves to go back inside. The curtains were still pinned back. We didn't dare look out the window. We pushed our hands together and bowed repeatedly toward the glass, begging whatever was out there to forgive us. We promised, out loud, that the moment the breakfast buffet opened at 6 a.m., we would bring it the best food we could find. We locked the door, pushed all our bags against it, and crammed all 4 of us into one bed. We put Na in the middle, sandwiching her between us, pulling a single blanket over all our heads. We thought we were protecting her. We thought if we hid her, the thing couldn't find her. We were so wrong. I must have drifted off out of sheer mental exhaustion. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. The AC was still off, but the room was freezing. It was a damp, heavy cold that sank right into my bones, the kind of cold that smells like wet earth and rotting seaweed. The second thing I noticed was that my back was cold. The warm body that was supposed to be pressed against me was gone. Na wasn't in the bed. I froze. My entire body went rigid. I couldn't even turn my head. Have you ever experienced sleep paralysis? That crushing weight on your chest, the absolute certainty that if you move, something in the dark will notice you? That's exactly how I felt, except I was fully awake. Then I heard this wet, heavy rhythmic smacking sound with a horrible pause in between each strike, sounding exactly like raw meat being violently slapped against a butcher's block over and over again. I slowly, agonizingly rolled my head to the side. The heavy wooden door of our room was wide open, letting in the faint yellowish light from the corridor. The window we had closed was also thrown wide open. And standing outside the window, on the narrow walkway right next to the ditch, was Na. She was facing into the room, but she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were rolled back, exposing the yellowish whites, completely devoid of focus. Her mouth was hanging slightly open in a slack, dead expression. She raised her right hand and brought it down across her own cheek, with sickening force, the wet smack echoing through the dead silence of the room. Her head whipped to the side, but she didn't flinch or blink as she slowly raised her left hand and did it again, delivering another brutal smack to her own face. It wasn't a slap to wake herself up. It was punishment. Someone was using her hands to beat her. Even in the dim light, I could see that her face was already deformed. Her cheeks were swollen, angry red and purple. A thin line of dark blood was leaking from the corner of her mouth, dripping down her chin. She had been doing this for God knows how long while we slept. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was completely constricted. The terror was a fucking physical object lodged in my airway. I finally managed to kick the girl next to me. She woke up, groggy, then followed my gaze. She let out a blood-curdling, high-pitched shriek. The spell broke. We scrambled off the bed, sobbing hysterically. We ran toward the window, but we didn't dare cross the threshold. We stood inside, reaching our hands out, begging. "Auntie, please, we are so fucking sorry, we will feed you. Just please let her go." I screamed into the dark air, but she completely ignored us, the relentless smacking continuing right before our eyes. One of the girls sprinted out the open door and ran down the corridor, banging on the doors of the teachers' rooms. Within minutes, 5 or 6 teachers came running in their pajamas. They stopped dead when they saw Na, grown men and women, completely paralyzed by the unnatural horror of a young girl mechanically destroying her own face with dead eyes. Of them stepped out onto that walkway, except for one. It was an older literature teacher. She didn't yell. She didn't panic. She walked calmly into our room, holding 3 lit sticks of incense she must have kept in her luggage. The smell of sandalwood immediately cut through the rotting smell in the room. She walked right up to the window, stepped out onto the walkway next to Na, and planted the incense sticks into a crack in the concrete, right at Na's feet. The teacher folded her hands and spoke in a steady, incredibly respectful tone, telling the empty air around Na that we were just guests passing through. She explained that this child was foolish and ignorant, and did not mean to offend the resident of this land, acknowledging our debt and promising that if it let the child sleep, we would pay our toll at first light. She bowed deeply. We all instinctively fell to our knees inside the room, pressing our foreheads to the floor, sobbing and praying. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, Na's raised hand slowly lowered. Her shoulders slumped. A massive shuddering gasp racked her body, and her eyes snapped into focus. She looked around, utterly confused, as the pain finally registered. She touched her swollen, bleeding face and collapsed into the teacher's arms, wailing. The rest of the night was a blur. They moved Na into the teacher's room. We didn't sleep a single wink. We sat huddled on the floor, watching the clock tick toward morning. At exactly 6 in the morning, the second the buffet opened, that same teacher, along with the 4 of us, went straight to the dessert section. We loaded plates with sweet cakes, pastries, and bowls of soup. We walked in absolute silence to the edge of that filthy ditch. We placed the food on the dirt. The teacher lit 3 more sticks of incense. I will never forget this detail as long as I live. The coastal wind was howling that morning. It was whipping our hair around, knocking over empty plastic cups on the tables nearby. But those 3 sticks of incense bent into an aggressive, sharp curve under the wind, yet the ash never broke off. It just burned down, glowing bright red, accepting the meal. We left that afternoon. On the bus ride back to Bin Duang, I asked Na what she remembered. She told me she didn't remember getting out of bed. The last thing she remembered was waking up paralyzed, feeling a tremendous weight on her chest. She said she saw a woman in her 30s, dressed in plain, old, faded clothes. Not a tourist, but a local from long before the resorts were built, straddling her. The woman had her hands wrapped around Na's throat, choking the life out of her. As for Bo, he was completely fine. He didn't remember a thing after passing out on the beach. He woke up later that night feeling a bit dizzy, but otherwise okay. We realized later what had happened. Whatever was in that ditch was wearing Bo because he was weak, but the moment Na, a girl with actual spiritual ties, stood at the window and directly challenged it, it found a much more interesting toys to play with. It dropped him and came straight for us. It's been years, and I still can't shake the trauma. My worldview was completely shattered that night. You grow up thinking monsters hide in dark woods or haunted mansions. You don't realize they can just be trapped in the filthy, discarded spaces between where we go to relax. I haven't slept with a window unlocked since that trip. Every time I check into a hotel, I have to inspect the perimeter. And sometimes, on nights when the AC breaks and the room gets a little too warm, a little too stuffy, I lie awake in the dark. I hold my breath, terrified that if I listen closely enough, I'll hear that heavy, wet sound. I've always been a pretty logical guy, never really bought into the whole ghost thing or spiritual stuff. You know, back when I was 15, my only real concern was hanging out with friends, not tagging along to a loud, chaotic wedding out in the suburbs as some sort of family spy. My aunt literally sent me to watch her husband, Uncle Holden, who had a terrible habit of drinking way too much. It was just a normal, exhausting, and honestly annoying day, and my brain was completely grounded in reality. I mean, you have to understand the dynamic here because it was a total mess from the start. Holden was a complicated guy, incredibly charming but terrible at making good life choices, and he actually had two families. He lived with my aunt in the city on Win Tree Fong Street, but his second family, his other wife, Lorraine, and her kids lived way out in Bin Duong. And on this specific weekend, Lorraine's youngest daughter was getting married. This was actually the third wedding I had to drag myself to with him over the last few years, so it was basically a miserable routine by now, and Holden had to go play the role of the proud father of the bride. My aunt, being intensely jealous and deeply suspicious, refused to let him go alone, so she practically forced me to go with him, just to make sure he didn't try to move back in with his second family or do anything stupid. The entire day was just a sweaty, sticky, mind-numbing test of my patience. If you've ever been to one of these massive, sprawling suburban weddings, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The air is thick with humidity. The karaoke speakers are blown out and screeching at maximum volume, and there's just this endless sea of plastic chairs and people shouting over each other. I just sat there in the corner, a bored teenager downing warm sodas, watching Holden take shot after shot of whatever cheap rice liquor the groom's family kept pouring for him. He was supposed to just do the ceremony and take me back to the city by the afternoon, but by 7 p.m., the guy was completely obliterated. I'm talking physically unable to stand up straight, slurring his words, totally blacked out. Lorraine took one look at him and told me that there was absolutely no way he was riding a motorbike back to the city in that condition, so we were going to have to sleep over. I was so annoyed, just incredibly frustrated, because I hated sleeping in unfamiliar places. But I didn't have a choice. Her house was this narrow, cramped concrete building, and because it was packed with relatives who came for the wedding, there were no spare beds. Lorraine just threw a thin woven straw mat right onto the bare tile floor on the ground floor, right next to the wooden staircase, and told us to make do. So there I was, lying on this rock-hard floor at 10 p.m., trying to fall asleep next to a 60-something-year-old man who was practically radiating body heat and the most disgusting smells you can imagine. He had been wearing a cheap suit all day in the sweltering heat, so the sour stench of old sweat, mixed with the heavy, nauseating odor of stale alcohol, was just suffocating me in that tiny space. And the snoring? Man, I can't even describe it. It wasn't just loud. It was this wet, rattling, aggressively uneven sound that vibrated right through the floorboards and made my teeth ache. I tossed and turned for a solid 20 minutes, getting more and more pissed off, until Lorraine finally came out of her room, complaining that she could hear him all the way through the walls. She told me to just grab my pillow and go sleep up in the loft so I could actually get some rest. I didn't argue. I grabbed my blanket and dragged myself up the creaky wooden stairs to the loft. Now, this loft wasn't really a room. It was basically just a low-ceilinged platform made of cheap plywood, and the only thing up there was a large Buddha altar taking up most of the space. Because it was so cramped, the only way I could physically fit was to lie flat on my back directly underneath the altar, with my head practically touching the back wall and my feet dangling right over the top edge of the staircase. It was a super weird, liminal space. The rest of the house was pitch black and dead silent, but up there, the altar had this tacky, circular neon halo light that just kept flashing blue, then red, then purple, casting these long, shifting shadows across the dusty floorboards. I don't know exactly what time it was when I finally drifted off, maybe somewhere past midnight, but I was in that heavy, exhausting kind of sleep when I felt something weird. I was lying there, completely dead to the world, when I felt this distinct, incredibly light sensation of someone dragging a single finger across the bottom of my left foot. It was just a tiny, scratchy movement, almost like a piece of rough paper brushing against my skin, but it was enough to make my leg jerk instinctively. I opened my eyes, blinking away the sleep, and just stared into the dark stairwell. Nothing. I was a little spooked, but my brain immediately went into defensive mode, doing that thing where you frantically search for a logical explanation so you don't panic. Lorraine had a couple of young grandkids in the house, these little terrors named Toby, Leo, and Ben, who had been running around screaming all day, and I convinced myself that one of them had crawled out of bed and was just messing with me from the stairs. I cleared my throat loudly, mumbling into the dark for them to go back to sleep before I got mad, and when I didn't hear any giggling, I just rolled over and forced my eyes shut again. I must have been asleep for another hour or so when the voice woke me up. It wasn't a shout, and it wasn't a whisper. It was this dry, raspy, incredibly tired sound echoing up from the ground floor. "Vance, let's go home." I jolted upright, rubbing the crust out of my eyes, completely disoriented. The flashing neon light from the altar was making me dizzy, but I leaned forward and peered over the edge of the stairs. Down there, in the pitch black, I could see the silhouette of Holden, standing at the bottom of the steps. Because of the angle of the loft, I could only see him from the chest up, but the faint streetlight filtering through the front window caught his silver hair perfectly. He was just standing there, completely motionless, staring up at the ceiling. "Vance, come on, we need to go home." I let out this massive, annoyed sigh, rubbing my temples because I was just so done with this whole crap. I yelled down to him, telling him to hold on a second, assuming that he had woken up from his drunken stupor and suddenly realized he needed to be back in the city to help my aunt set up her food stall early in the morning. I gathered my blanket, swung my legs over the side, and sleepily trudged halfway down the wooden stairs. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked down at the tile floor. Holden was still lying on the straw mat. He was completely spread eagle, his arms thrown out to the sides, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, and he was fast asleep. I stood there on the stairs, my brain completely short-circuiting, looking at the empty spot at the bottom of the stairs where I swore I had just seen him standing 10 seconds ago, and then looking back at his body on the mat. If you had asked me right then if I was scared, I would have said no. Honestly, I was just confused as hell and irritated. When you're dealing with a hardcore alcoholic, you get used to them doing deeply weird, inexplicable things in the middle of the night. I convinced myself that he had sleepwalked over to the stairs, muttered some nonsense, and then just collapsed back onto the mat before I made it halfway down. I checked the cheap Casio watch on my wrist. It was exactly 1:45 a.m. I rolled my eyes, muttered a few curses under my breath about how ridiculous this whole situation was, and stomped back up to the loft, throwing myself back onto my pillow. That right there, that moment of pure naive rationalization, is the thing I beat myself up over the most when I look back on this 100% true account of what happened. The human mind will go to absurd, embarrassing lengths to deny the presence of something completely horrifying just to maintain a fragile illusion of safety. If I had just walked 2 steps closer, if I had just checked on him. But I didn't. I just went back to sleep. The next time I woke up, the denial loop completely shattered. It was deep into the night, that heavy, oppressive part of the early morning where the air feels incredibly cold and perfectly still. I was violently pulled out of sleep by the sensation of something aggressively digging into the side of my foot. This wasn't a light tickle like before. It was a hard, urgent scratching, like jagged fingernails trying to grab my ankle. I snapped my eyes open, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs, and out of pure reflex, I kicked out as hard as I could. My heel connected directly with a cold, solid arm, and I heard this dull thud. I shot up, pulling my knees to my chest, and stared at the top of the stairs. Holden's shadow was right there, lingering at the very top step, and when I kicked him, I physically watched his silhouette shrink backward, retreating down the stairs into the darkness. At this point, the fear hadn't fully mutated into terror yet. It was just this boiling, defensive anger. I thought this drunk old man was actually crawling up the stairs to physically mess with me in the middle of the night. I leaned over the edge and yelled down into the dark, telling him to stop acting crazy, that it was barely 3 a.m. and I wasn't going anywhere in the pitch black. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. I laid back down, my breathing heavy and uneven, my adrenaline spiking. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes, and then I heard it. I was lying there trying to force my eyes shut when I heard this slow, agonizingly deliberate squeak of the wooden stairs groaning under someone's weight, step by terrifying step. It was the sound of someone creeping up the stairs as quietly as they physically could, trying not to be noticed. Every muscle in my body locked up, my mouth went completely dry. I slowly, carefully inched my head up from the pillow, my neck stiff with tension, and looked toward the stairwell. Holden was walking up the stairs, but something was profoundly, sickeningly wrong. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. He was just in his white dress shirt, half untucked from his trousers. As he reached the top step, he didn't stand up straight. Instead, he slowly sank down and sat cross-legged right at the edge of the loft, pulling his shoulders in tight, making himself look incredibly small and fragile. He was cowering. He looked absolutely terrified of the Buddha altar behind me, keeping his head bowed, his hands resting limply on his knees. The neon halo light from the altar was flashing directly onto his face, blue, red, purple, illuminating his features in these harsh, rhythmic bursts. His skin was the color of dirty ash, completely devoid of blood, and his eyes were wide, vacant, and filled with this bottomless, devastating despair. "Vance," he whimpered, and his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, hollow and totally disconnected from his moving lips. "I can't find my way home. It's so cold. Take me home, Vance. I'm so cold." My brain literally could not process the visual data it was receiving. I was sitting barely 3 feet away from him, and the amount of detail I could see was paralyzing. I could see the sweat stains on his collar, the deep wrinkles around his eyes, the way his jaw trembled. It was too real to be a dream. I stammered, my voice cracking, desperately trying to reason with him, pointing out that it was the middle of the night, that I didn't know the roads, that he had to drive us. "I don't know the way anymore," he cried, his voice breaking into this pathetic, terrifying sob. "Please, just take me home." I blinked. Just one single, frantic blink to clear the burning sweat from my eyes, and he was gone. Empty air. No footsteps retreating, no sound of movement. He just ceased to exist in that physical space. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. The air in the loft suddenly felt freezing, biting right through my clothes. I scrambled to the edge of the stairs, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the wooden railing, and I peered over, down on the ground floor, illuminated by the faint ambient light. The body was exactly where it had been hours ago, spread eagle, arms thrown to the sides. head tilted back. He hadn't moved. He hadn't ever moved. I completely lost my mind, plunging back into my blanket, pulling it over my head, shivering uncontrollably. I was experiencing a full psychological breakdown, praying to anything that would listen that I was just having a severe hallucination from the heat and the stress. Eventually, sheer mental exhaustion dragged me down into this chaotic, suffocating nightmare. In the dream, I was lying in the exact same spot, under the flashing neon lights. The floorboards creaked violently, and suddenly Holden was towering over me. His face was twisted into this mask of absolute fury, his eyes bulging, his teeth bared. He reached down with an icy, vice-like grip and pinched my earlobe. Hard. The pain was sharp, electric, and agonizingly real. "I'm dead," he screamed, his voice tearing through my skull like a siren. "I died in a stranger's house. You have to take me home right now before my body rots. Don't leave me here to rot." I violently gasped for air, my entire body thrashing as I jolted awake. I was drenched in a cold, slippery sweat. My chest was heaving, my lungs burning as I tried to pull in oxygen. And my left earlobe was burning, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, as if someone had just dug their fingernails into the cartilage. That was the moment the primal intuition kicked in. You know that feeling? That deep, ancient survival instinct that bypasses all logic and just screams at you that something is fundamentally broken in your reality. My heart wasn't just beating fast. It felt like a heavy stone sitting in the bottom of my stomach. I didn't think. I just moved. I slowly crawled to the top of the stairs, my joints popping in the oppressive silence, and I looked down at the ground floor. It was almost 4 in the morning. The faint gray pre-dawn light was just starting to seep through the window cracks. Holden's body was in the exact same position. He had been lying on a freezing tile floor for over 6 hours, a man with a known history of severe heart disease, completely exposed to the cold drafts coming under the door. He wasn't snoring anymore. The house was completely, devastatingly silent. I began my descent. One step, then another. My legs felt like they were made of lead, trembling so violently I had to lean all my weight against the wall. I crept closer, my breath catching in my throat, softly calling his name, whispering into the dark, praying for a grunt, a snore, any sign of life. I got to the bottom of the stairs. I was standing maybe 6 feet away from his rigid, unmoving form. I stared at his chest, begging for it to rise and fall. It was completely still. And then, right in that suffocating pocket of silence, I heard it. Vance. The voice didn't come from the body on the floor. It came from above me, from the loft. "Vance, I'm dead. Tell Lorraine to take my body home." Holy fucking shit. I slowly, mechanically tilted my head up. The loft was partially visible through the gaps in the wooden railing. Sitting up there, right next to the flashing Buddha altar, was Holden. His ghost was just sitting there, arms wrapped around his knees, staring down at me with this hollow, mournful, completely empty expression. It looked like absolute hell. I looked up at his spirit trapped in the loft, and then I slowly lowered my eyes to look at his physical corpse lying on the tile floor directly in front of me. I was trapped in this impossible, mind-breaking triangle of reality, looking at a dead man's shell while his soul begged me for a ride home. I broke. I completely and utterly broke. I practically threw myself backward, scrambling away from the corpse, slipping on the tile floor, scraping my knees, and launching myself at Lorraine's bedroom door at the back of the house. I slammed my fists against the cheap wood, screaming her name, sobbing, completely hysterical. When she finally yanked the door open, groggy and annoyed, I just pointed a shaking finger at the hallway. She cursed at me, thinking I was just overreacting to his drinking, and stomped over to the mat. I watched her reach down to shake his shoulder. I watched her hand recoil as if she had touched a hot stove. And then I heard the scream, this guttural, horrific wail that tore through the quiet neighborhood as she realized he was completely stiff and cold to the touch. The rest of the morning was a blur of crying relatives and neighbors swarming the house, quickly buying a wooden coffin to lay him in. They loaded him into an ambulance, and I sat in the back of that sterile, brightly lit van the entire 2-hour drive back to the city, staring blankly at the body bag, completely mute. For the next few days during the funeral, I just completely shut down, sitting in the corner burning joss paper for him. He knew. The moment his heart gave out on that cold floor, his soul realized it was trapped in a place it didn't belong, and he spent his final fading moments desperately trying to orchestrate his own post-mortem rescue through a terrified teenager. The absolute worst part of all this is the paralyzing thought of what would have happened if I had just ignored him and gone back to sleep. I would have spent the entire night lying just a few feet away from a decaying corpse without even knowing it. That realization completely stripped away my sense of safety, and honestly, I haven't slept properly in an unfamiliar room since I was a teenager. Every creak of the floorboards, every cold draft, it just throws me right back to that terrifying night. My old neighborhood is insanely expensive nowadays, totally commercialized with neon signs everywhere. But back in the 90s, when my parents first moved in, you'd walk 5 steps off the main road and bump into tombstones. We had this packed house, grandparents, aunts, kids, everyone living on top of each other. The only guy who didn't contribute was my youngest uncle, a lazy drunk whose absolute worst habit was stumbling home and pissing on every single wall or empty dirt lot he could find. And when I say every single wall, I mean the man treated our entire zip code like his personal toilet. Most of the adults in my family were hustling hard, driving cyclos, running motorbike taxis, or grinding away as government clerks. He was pushing 30, didn't have a job, and spent whatever loose change he could scrape together, maybe a few $100,000 dong, like 15 or 20 bucks back then, which was still enough to get you completely plastered, on cheap rice wine and underground gambling. He was such a mess that we constantly had sketchy gangsters showing up at our front gate to collect his debts. We lived down this ridiculously deep alleyway in District 10, right off New Scene Tree Fung Street. In Saigon, they call it a 4/address. You turn off the chaotic main road, take a sharp right, a long left, another right, and finally squeeze into this narrow, claustrophobic concrete trench where our front gate was. Back then, the city was slowly paving over the old graveyards that used to surround our house. Families were exhuming their relatives, moving the bones, and leaving behind these sunken, porous patches of dark dirt. My uncle, let's call him Uncle Upton, was terrified of actual visible tombstones. He was a coward at heart. But once a grave was dug up and flattened into an empty dirt lot, he figured it was fair game. He'd stumble home around midnight, completely cross-eyed, and just let loose right where somebody's ancestors used to rest. It got so bad that the neighbors started complaining about the permanent, eye-watering stench of ammonia baking in the tropical humidity right outside our doors. My parents used to joke, in that bitter, exhausted way people do when they're stuck with a deadbeat relative, that keeping Upton around didn't cost us any extra in water bills because he literally never used our bathroom. We all just thought he was a gross, pathetic alcoholic. But then around the year 2001, things got weird. People in the neighborhood started calling him the human bus terminal. That was the exact phrase they used, because whatever was happening to him, it wasn't just one entity. It was like a revolving door of absolute madness. He'd come home drunk, but his posture would be entirely wrong. He was usually this hunched-over, apologetic loser who would scurry away if you yelled at him. But suddenly, he'd be strutting down the alleyway at 10 in the night, picking fights with the toughest guys on the block, getting up in their faces and threatening to bash their skulls in with this deep, raspy voice that didn't even sound human. Then, 2 days later, my aunts would find him wandering the street, with bright red lipstick smeared all over his mouth, swaying his hips and giggling into the darkness. I was too young to fully process it, but my parents vividly remember this one afternoon where a bunch of local kids were hanging out, eating those cheap, sugary candies, shaped like baby pacifiers. Upton just shuffled out of the house, walked right into the middle of their group, snatched a candy from a little girl, and sat down in the dirt. He just sat there, aggressively sucking on this plastic pacifier with this dead, hollow look in his eyes, completely ignoring the kids screaming for their parents. Everyone's brain immediately went to the most logical conclusion: internal gaslighting at its finest, right? My dad just kept telling everyone that the cheap alcohol had finally dissolved Upton's frontal lobe. He was having psychotic breaks. It was brain damage, plain and simple. No one wanted to admit that something invisible was hitching a ride on his shoulders every time his guard dropped. But you can only deny reality for so long, especially when it turns violent. And man, this is where it gets incredibly hard to talk about. Upton started losing weight at this terrifying rate. He looked like a walking skeleton, wrapped in yellowing skin. And then, the night terrors began. It was always around midnight. My parents would be trying to sleep in the stifling heat, and they'd hear this muffled, rhythmic thumping coming from his room. Just this dull, meat-slapping meat sound, accompanied by Upton crying and screaming at the top of his lungs. They rushed down one night, busted the lock on his door, and found him curled on the floor. He was repeatedly, viciously punching himself right in the groin, just hammering his fists into his own lap over and over, while screaming at himself in this bizarre overlapping tone. "You like to piss?" he'd scream, punching himself. "You like to piss? I'll rip your freaking junk off." My dad had to physically pin his arms down. The second they restrained him, Upton just blinked. His eyes rolled back, and he snapped out of it, instantly reverting back to a confused, drunk idiot asking why everyone was in his room. It happened 3 or 4 more times. Each time, the self-mutilation got worse. The absolute breaking point, the moment where the thin veneer of, "he's just a crazy drunk," shattered, was a few nights later. They heard the screaming again, but this time, the thudding sound was heavy. It was a dense, sickening wooden crunch. My dad kicked the door open, and Upton was sitting there with a massive solid wood pestle, the kind you use to crush hard spices and garlic in a mortar. He was swinging it down into his own crotch with every ounce of strength his frail body had. There was blood everywhere. It was a level of primal body horror madness that you can't unsee. They wrestled the freaking thing out of his hands and rushed him to the emergency room. He spent almost a week in the hospital with severe internal trauma. The doctors honestly didn't know if he'd ever be fully functional down there again, warning him that he might have permanently sterilized himself. When they finally brought him home, he was put on strict bed rest, no alcohol, no going out. They literally locked him inside. And that's when the entities realized they didn't need him to be drunk anymore. Every single morning, Upton would wake up shivering, asking my mom why there were so many beggars crowding the front gate at night. He described dozens of people, skinny, sick-looking women, old men missing limbs, little kids covered in dirt, just clinging to the iron bars of our front gate, staring into the house. My mom told him to shut up and go back to sleep, but the next day he started crying, saying that the crowd outside wasn't just staring anymore. They were whispering, and they were whispering his birth name. Now, back in the day, nobody used real names. You were called by your birth order or a nickname. Even his own siblings just called him the youngest or used some goofy childhood nickname. But he said these hollowed-out things were standing in the alley, chanting his exact legal birth name over and over in this overlapping, buzzing chorus. The final day started with a massive red flag that is practically a universal warning sign in Asian culture. Upton woke up totally lucid. He showered. He put on his best button-down shirt. He walked out to the living room, lit incense at the family altar, something he had literally never done in his entire life, and hugged my grandparents, sobbing, thanking them for putting up with him. Everyone thought he was just manipulating them, trying to act like a reformed saint, so they'd let him out to buy a drink. They ignored it and went to bed. At roughly 2 in the morning, the entire house was jolted awake by this booming, authoritative voice echoing from the ground floor. My parents ran downstairs and found Upton sitting cross-legged in the dead center of the living room floor. But it wasn't him. His posture was rigid, his shoulders squared, and he was slowly stroking his chin like he had a long, flowing beard. He was in his 20s, completely clean-shaven, but his hand moved exactly like an ancient village elder holding court. He didn't even look at my parents. He just stared straight ahead at the blank wall and announced in this deep, bossy voice that this boy was out of time. He pissed on our heads, the voice said, cold and absolute. He disrespected our homes. You didn't know how to appease us, and now his time is up. We are taking him. And then the dam broke. For the next 2 hours, my parents and half the neighborhood who had gathered at the door watched a horrific, supernatural talent show. The old man vanished, and suddenly Upton was a pregnant woman, rubbing his stomach and sobbing about hanging herself. Then his spine snapped sideways, and he was a teenager screaming about being electrocuted. Then he was someone else entirely, crying about getting shredded by shrapnel while running from a war zone. Then he dropped to his hands and knees, giggling and crawling around the floor like a 6-month-old infant. It was an endless, suffocating parade of dead things taking turns wearing my uncle's skin, all of them violently trauma-dumping their final moments onto the living. By 5 in the morning, the possession stopped. Upton collapsed onto the tiles. He was completely paralyzed from the neck down. His eyes were wide, darting around the room in absolute, primal panic. He started screaming for his mom, begging his brothers to help him. "They're behind me," he shrieked, his voice cracking into this wet, pathetic gargle. "They're holding my arms. They're beating me. Pull them off." My dad and the neighbors hoisted his stiff, frozen body into a pedicab and sprinted toward the nearest hospital. The entire way there, tearing down the empty pre-dawn streets, Upton was sobbing, hyperventilating, begging whatever unseen things were clinging to his back to stop hurting him. They carried him through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, and the absolute second they crossed the threshold, his eyes rolled back, and he died, just completely flatlined. His heart stopped, his lungs quit. Whatever had attached itself to him had ripped his soul right out of his chest before the doctors could even put a stethoscope on him. The ER doctor just looked at my dad and sighed. "Take him home and do the funeral," he said. "Don't even leave the body here, or I'll have to hold it, and the paperwork will be a massive headache." You'd think the nightmare ended there. We cremated him, hoping that was the end of it, but we didn't realize that by trapping him in the house during his final days, the things that possessed him had simply moved in with us. Just 2 days after his funeral, the house completely turned on us. It was relentless. You'd be sitting in the living room and clearly hear the sound of someone aggressively washing dishes in the kitchen, plates clinking, water splashing. But the kitchen was pitch black and empty. Light bulbs shattered for no reason. The 2 little potted plants my mom kept in the front yard turned black and withered into dust overnight. The stray dogs in the alley would sit perfectly still outside our gate, tilting their heads up at the second-floor balcony, just howling this long, mournful wail for hours, and the neighborhood cats would just scream and meow wildly into the pitch black. People started tripping on the stairs for no reason, or they'd violently wipe out and break their legs just trying to wheel their motorbikes into the front room. The scariest part wasn't the noises, though. It was the physical space rejecting us. The floor tiles in the living room started cracking, not a slow, structural settling. You'd be eating dinner, and suddenly you'd hear this loud, explosive snap, like a bone breaking, and a huge fissure would just tear across 4 or 5 heavy ceramic tiles right under your feet. It felt like something massive, something incredibly heavy and angry, was constantly pacing back and forth, stomping on the floorboards, trying to crush us out. Within 30 days of Upton's death, my entire extended family, all 15 of us, packed up, sold the property for pennies on the dollar, and scattered. Fast forward to 2009. I was a teenager by then, navigating a Saigon that was exploding with modernization. The dirt lots were gone, replaced by towering concrete houses and brightly lit boba shops. The story of my Uncle Upton was something I vaguely remembered, as a childhood nightmare, mostly just used by my parents as a threat to keep me from playing out late. Growing up, all the kids in the alley had this unspoken 7 p.m. curfew. If we were playing outside after dark, we'd aggressively shush each other. Don't scream. Don't laugh out loud, we'd whisper, or the ghosts will take you like they took Uncle Upton. But by the time I was a teen, I didn't care anymore. I was hanging out with my friends on the main avenue, stuffing our faces with that famous Wai Fiong 7-color sweet soup and drinking entirely too much cheap milk tea. My bicycle had actually broken down earlier that day, which was the only reason I was stuck walking. By the time we split up to head home, it was probably around 10:15 p.m., and my bladder was screaming. I mean, my teeth were practically floating. I actually stopped by a street vendor on the main road and frantically asked if she had a restroom. The old lady just laughed at me. "You're a guy, aren't you?" she said. Just pointed at a freaking tree. But the main road was too bright. I lived only a few blocks away, but in my frantic, desperate state, I decided to take the shortcut, the 4/alleyway that led right past my family's old, abandoned house. The property had changed hands like 4 times in the past decade. Nobody ever stayed longer than a few months. That night, the iron gate was chained shut, the courtyard overgrown with weeds. I was walking fast, clenching my jaw, doing that awkward, stiff-legged shuffle because I was literally seconds away from wetting myself. I got right up to the rusted gate of the old house, thinking I could just duck into the shadows and relieve myself against the wall. I mean, nobody was around, but as I stepped into the alcove, I froze. Standing right there, facing the cracked, stucco wall of the abandoned house, was a man. He was wearing an old faded t-shirt and baggy jeans, and he was swaying slightly, his hands fumbling at his waist. He was pissing against the wall. I was so physically distressed, so hyper-focused on the sound of the stream hitting the concrete and the overwhelming relief I desperately needed, that my brain didn't even register the absurdity of the situation. I didn't care who he was. I just thought, if this guy is doing it, I'm doing it too. I stepped up about 6 feet away from him, let out a shaky breath, and reached for my zipper. Before I could even pull it down, the man violently whipped around. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked. I flinched so hard I nearly bit my tongue. I stammered, trying to apologize, saying I just really needed to go, but he took a step toward me, and the dim yellow light from the street lamp caught his face. My stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. Even though I was just a toddler when he died, I had seen the altar photos a million times. The hollow cheeks, the messy hair, the terrified, sunken eyes. It was Uncle Upton. He looked exactly like he did the week he died, standing right in front of me in the flesh. "Who said you could piss here?" he screamed, his voice distorted, layered with this awful, wet, rattling sound. "They'll take you. You want to end up like me. You want them to do to you what they did to me." The second he yelled, the suffocating silence of the alleyway shattered. From inside the dark, empty shell of the abandoned house behind him, a noise erupted. It sounded like a schoolyard during recess, but entirely composed of overlapping weeping, maniacal giggling, and frantic scratching. I looked past Upton's shoulder, through the rusted bars of the gate. The house was completely swarming. There were dozens of them, thick, oily black silhouettes writhing all over the courtyard. Some were crawling on their bellies across the cracked tiles. Some were sitting perfectly still on the balcony ledges, their heads cocked at impossible angles, staring down at me. Some were hanging upside down from the rotting door frames. It was a sea of hollowed-out shapes, twitching and shifting in the darkness, and the noise they were making was this deafening, buzzing hum that vibrated right through my teeth. My brain completely short-circuited. I couldn't process the sheer volume of impossible things in front of me. I remember my eyes locking onto a single, rusted screw sticking out of the hinge of the iron gate. I just stared at that screw. I focused every ounce of my sanity on the orange rust on that tiny piece of metal, violently rejecting the reality of the writhing darkness just inches beyond it. "Go!" Upton roared, lunging forward and shoving me hard in the chest. "Go home! Now!" The physical contact, the freezing, absolute zero impact of his hands on my shirt, shattered whatever control I had left. I stumbled backward, the terror completely overriding my nervous system, and I instantly, uncontrollably wet myself. I hauled ass back to my house, literally trailing pee the entire way, while trying to hold myself together. My family totally clowned me at first, seeing a teenager wet himself. But when I sobbed and told them what I saw, my mom quietly got me some clean jeans and started burning incense. I completely avoided that shortcut from then on, even if it meant a longer walk. And honestly, that house, it's still plastered with "for lease" signs today, totally abandoned. You know that weird, unsettling feeling of déjà vu, right? Like your brain misfires for a split second, and you swear you've lived this exact moment before? Most of the time, it's harmless. You brush it off. But I'm going to tell you about a time when déjà vu wasn't just a glitch in the Matrix. It was a physical, horrifying reminder that some things in this world do not move on. They just sit in the dark, and they wait for you to come back. Honestly, to really make you understand how messed up this is, I have to take you way back. I'm a local, born and raised in Đà Lạt, a mountain town here in Vietnam that's famous for its pine forests and year-round cold weather. And I mean, I'm in my late 30s now, so I'm talking about roughly 20 years ago, maybe back in 2003 or 2004. I don't remember the exact year, but my brain has permanently bookmarked the feeling of the town back then. It was completely different from the bustling tourist trap it is today. Back then, Đà Lạt was quiet. It was vastly spread out, the fog was incredibly thick, almost suffocating, and the pine forests were dense and untouched. The roads were decent if you stayed right in the city center near the main market, but man, the second you rode your bike maybe a mile or two outside the center, the paved roads just vanished into these rough dirt paths. Anyway, I was around 15 or 16 at the time, just a dumb teenager who thought she knew everything, and I had this boyfriend. Let's just call him Patrick. So Patrick and I, we were in that sickeningly sweet puppy love phase. Every evening we'd ride our bicycles around the hills. Now there was this one specific stretch of road we called Slope Number 5. It's on the way to the outskirts, heading towards the neighboring provinces. Today, if you go there, that slope is absolutely packed with these trendy aesthetic cafes where tourists sit to look down into the valleys. But 20 years ago, there was nothing. Just dirt, wild grass, and absolute darkness. It must have been a little past 7:30 p.m., and in Đà Lạt, once the sun dips, the temperature just plummets and the streets empty out. You'd occasionally see a local flying down the steep dirt hills on a motorbike, totally reckless. But other than that, it was just dead quiet. No streetlights, just the faint, distant glow from the greenhouses down in the valley. So Patrick, trying to be this romantic guy, tells me he found a new secret spot. He pedals his bike all the way to my house, picks me up, and I'm sitting on the back rack while he labors up these massive hills for nearly 45 minutes. We finally reached the top of Slope Number 5. I remember complaining, asking him what the big deal was, considering we rode past this area all the time, but he just smiled, pulled the bike off the main dirt road, and pushed through this thick patch of overgrown bushes. He led me to this little dirt outcropping, a small ledge that jutted out over the hillside, maybe just wide enough to park a car. He laid down a jacket, and we sat there right near the edge, and I have to admit, it was breathtaking. If you looked to the left, you saw the faint lights of the sleeping town and the silhouette of the massive mountains in the distance. To the right, you could see the glowing glass of the agricultural greenhouses far below. We were sitting there, my head resting on his shoulder, talking about whatever nonsense teenagers talk about. It was perfect. But that perfection lasted maybe 5 minutes. Because as we were sitting there, huddled together against the biting chill, Patrick suddenly tensed up. We were sitting maybe 2 feet away from the actual drop-off of the cliff. Patrick was kind of hunched forward, his knees pulled up, looking down into the pitch-black abyss right below our feet. I asked him what was wrong, and he hushed me, saying he kept hearing this weird, repetitive rustling noise down the slope, figuring it was probably just a stray dog or a feral cat rooting around in the brush. I strained my eyes in the dark, pushing my hair back. but I couldn't see a damn thing. Then he pointed, his finger trembling just a little, telling me to look at this specific clump of tall grass just over the edge because it was violently shaking. Now my first thought was snakes. I am terrified of snakes. But a snake sliding over dirt doesn't make a heavy bush thrash back and forth like that. Whatever was down there had mass. It had weight. I was getting seriously annoyed. Like, here I am, thinking I'm about to get my first real romantic kiss under the stars, and this guy is obsessing over a raccoon or whatever. I told him to just ignore it and focus on me, dropping all these obvious hints that we should just make out or go home before my mom realized I was gone. He kind of chuckled, turning back to me, saying something sweet about how we had been together for 6 months, and right before I could reply, he violently flinched. He scrambled onto his knees, leaning perilously over the edge of the drop-off, calling out into the dark. I was so confused, asking him who the hell he was talking to. He looked back at me, his face pale in the moonlight, and muttered that he just heard a voice down there, a human voice. He said it sounded like someone groaning, begging for help to be pulled up. My stomach instantly tied itself into a cold, heavy knot. We were at the edge of a massive, steep drop. If someone had fallen down there in the pitch black, they could be seriously hurt. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my jeans, nervously peering over his shoulder. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. I just stood there, uselessly asking if someone was down there. Patrick, being the brave teenage guy, told me to step back from the edge. He said he was going to climb down just a little bit to see if he could reach whoever it was, because he was convinced it was the voice of an older woman. I begged him not to. The slope was practically vertical, just loose dirt and sharp rocks, but he brushed off my concerns, saying he hiked these hills with his buddies all the time and knew how to slide down safely. So he sat on the edge and slowly began to scoot himself down the precipice, using his heels to brake and his hands to grip the thick roots of the wild grass. He slid down maybe 10 feet into the darkness, the sounds of shifting dirt and snapping twigs echoing loudly in the quiet night. Then, he stopped. He anchored himself, reached his hand out further down into the darkness, and started speaking in this incredibly gentle, reassuring tone. He kept saying things like, "Here, grab my hand. Let me help you. Oh my God, how did you fall all the way down here? Just hold on tight." I was standing at the top, squinting so hard my head hurt, wondering how I couldn't hear the person he was talking to. I still couldn't see anyone. I couldn't hear any crying, just Patrick's voice. And then, everything went to hell. Without any warning, Patrick let out this guttural, horrific shriek. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was the raw, primal sound of absolute terror. He violently recoiled, twisting his body around on the steep slope, and started scrambling back up the dirt wall like a wild animal. His face, I will never forget his face. It was completely drained of blood, his eyes bulging out of his skull, filled with a panic that was so infectious it made my knees buckle. He clawed his way over the ledge, and I grabbed the collar of his jacket to haul him the rest of the way up. We both tumbled backward into the dirt, rolling over each other. He didn't even pause to catch his breath. He just scrambled to his feet, screaming at me to run, screaming that there were ghosts, that we needed to get the fuck out of there right now. I was completely paralyzed with confusion, but when the guy you love is having a mental breakdown, your survival instincts just take the wheel. We unlocked the bikes with shaking hands and we rode. We bombed down that dirt hill in the pitch black like lunatics. We wiped out twice, scraping the skin off our knees and elbows on the gravel, but we didn't care. We just picked up the bikes and kept pedaling until my lungs felt like they were bleeding. We didn't stop until we hit the center of town, right by the main lake, where there were a few late-night street vendors and motorbike taxi drivers hanging around. We slumped down at a small plastic table, the bright street lights finally offering some safety, and ordered 2 cups of steaming hot soy milk. Patrick was shivering so violently he could barely hold the plastic cup. The cold night air in Dalat is harsh, but he was shivering from the inside out. Once he finally caught his breath, he told me what happened down on that slope. He said that as he slid down, he finally saw where the rustling was coming from. clinging to the side of the dirt wall was a very old woman. She had one of those traditional woven wicker baskets strapped to her back, the kind the indigenous locals used to forage for wood or wild fruit. She was lying flat against the steep dirt, her frail fingers desperately gripping a clump of weeds. Patrick said she slowly tilted her head back to look at him, and her face was ancient. Not just old, but unnaturally weathered, covered in deep, dark wrinkles. Her face was scratched and bleeding, like she had tumbled a long way down through the thorns. He said she looked so incredibly pitiful, groaning and begging for him to pull her up. So, he extended his hand. He told me that the second she grabbed his hand, his heart almost stopped. Her grip was insanely strong. For a frail, tiny old woman, her fingers locked onto his wrist like an industrial vice. It hurt. It genuinely felt like his bones were grinding together. But the worst part was the temperature. Dalat is freezing, but he said her skin felt like plunging his hand into a bucket of crushed ice. It was a deep, biting cold that shot straight up his arm and numbed his shoulder. He braced his feet against a root, gritted his teeth, and pulled with all his teenage strength. But she wouldn't budge. He said it felt like he was trying to pull up a cement block. It was like she was actively resisting him, dragging him closer to the edge. He yelled at her that she was too heavy, and he decided to give it one massive final heave, thinking maybe it would hurt her arm, but it was better than letting her fall. So he counted to 3 in his head, leaned all his weight backward, and yanked. And as he pulled, he heard this wet, tearing sound. He fell backward onto the dirt slope as the sudden release of tension sent him flying. He quickly looked down to see if she had fallen. She hadn't fallen. She was still plastered to the side of the cliff, but her arm was gone. He had literally ripped her arm completely out of its socket. He stared at her in absolute horror, and she looked back at him, but she wasn't groaning anymore. Her eyes, which had looked so tired and pitiful just a second ago, were now glowing a deep, sickly red in the dark. They were wide and manic, and she started to smile. She just hung there on the side of the cliff, missing an arm, staring at him with those red eyes, and she let out this silent, shaking laugh. Her shoulders were heaving, but no sound came out of her mouth. Patrick was hyperventilating as he told me this, saying he looked down at his own hand, expecting to see a severed, bloody limb, but he wasn't holding an arm. He was tightly gripping a dry, dead tree branch. It was roughly the thickness of a human wrist. In the span of a single blink, the freezing hand he was holding had turned into a piece of dead wood. That's when his mind shattered. He threw the branch into the dark and scrambled up the cliff to me. Hearing that story as a 14-year-old girl, it messed me up. I was so traumatized, I made him swear we would never, ever go near slope number 5 again. Eventually, as years passed, Patrick and I drifted apart, not because of the ghost, just typical teenage stuff. We broke up, went our separate ways, but remained decent friends. We grew up, went to high school, got new partners. Later, I moved to Saigon for about 6 or 7 years to study and build my career, completely disconnecting from my hometown for a long while. Fast forward to around 2015, I finally moved back to Dalat for work. Naturally, I reconnected with my old high school friend group, including Patrick. We were all adults now, in our late 20s, catching up on life. Someone suggested we go grab coffee, mentioning that the town had changed so much and there were all these amazing new spots. They suggested this very famous, incredibly beautiful cafe built right into the side of a hill. They mentioned it was located on the road we used to call slope number 5. Honestly, it had been over a decade. The memory of that terrifying night had faded into this blurry, almost unreal childhood nightmare. Patrick and I barely ever thought about it. So, a group of 8 of us drove out there on a Saturday night. The place was unrecognizable. It was gorgeous, completely paved over, decorated with imported pine trees, warm string lights, and packed with hundreds of tourists. It was so crowded we actually had to wait for a table. The staff eventually led us down a series of wooden stairs to a secluded, slightly cramped table near the back, right up against the edge of the property line which looked out over the valley. We were having a great time, laughing, sharing old stories. About 20 minutes in, Patrick excused himself to use the restroom. Because the cafe was built on a steep incline, the restroom was located about 20 feet away from our table, situated right on the edge of the property where the manicured garden met the wild, untamed hillside. I happened to be watching him because I needed to use the restroom next and was waiting for him to finish. I saw him push the wooden door open and step out into the cool night air. He took 2 steps, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. I watched him slowly turn his head toward the boundary of the cafe. The property was separated from the wild cliffside by this rustic, waist-high fence made of thick, planted wooden stakes with light bulbs strung between them. Patrick just stood there, staring at the dark bushes just beyond the fence. Then, his whole demeanor changed. He suddenly lunged forward, throwing his torso over the wooden fence, reaching his arms frantically down into the darkness. He started yelling, not in fear, but in urgency. He yelled back at our table, demanding that the guys come help him pull someone up. He screamed that an old woman had slipped over the edge and was hanging onto the dirt. A few of the guys immediately pushed their chairs back to run over and help, but before they could even take 3 steps, I watched Patrick violently throw his weight backward. He yanked his arms up with extreme force, stumbling backward and crashing into the wooden fence. The force of his body snapped the decorative stakes, tearing the string lights down and plunging that entire section of the cafe into darkness. He was scrambling backward on the patio floor, desperately wiping his hands on his jeans, staring at a thick piece of the broken wooden fence he had inadvertently ripped out of the ground. Our friends rushed over in the dark, asking where the woman was, asking if he was okay. Patrick didn't say a word. He was pale, sweating profusely in the freezing air, his chest heaving. He refused to look over the edge. He just kept shaking his head, his voice trembling, saying there was no woman. He demanded we leave immediately. He wouldn't take no for an answer. We hadn't even gotten all our drinks yet, but he practically sprinted to the register, threw cash on the counter, and walked out to the street. We followed him, totally bewildered, and relocated to a cheap, brightly lit street vendor in the middle of town. Once he finally calmed down, staring blankly into a cup of hot tea, he looked at me, and he told the group what had just happened. He said he walked out of the bathroom, and he heard the rustling. It was the exact same heavy, deliberate thrashing in the bushes just beyond the cafe's lights. He looked over the fence, and he saw a hand waving in the darkness, and heard the frail, raspy voice of an old woman begging to be pulled up. He said his brain just went into autopilot. It had been 15 years. The area was completely transformed. He honestly thought a clumsy tourist had wandered past the fence and fallen. He lunged over the barrier, reached down, and grabbed the woman's hand, but the second his fingers wrapped around hers, the realization hit him like a freight train. It was the cold. That impossible, bone-crushing cold, and the vice-like grip that felt like it was grinding his knuckles into dust. In that agonizing split second, his adult brain synced up with his teenage memory. He realized exactly where he was standing. He realized exactly whose hand he was holding. He looked down, and through the dim, ambient light of the cafe, he saw her. The exact same weathered face, the exact same woven basket strapped to her back. He panicked and tried to pull his hand away, jerking his body backward. And just like 15 years ago, her arm detached from her shoulder. He watched the limb separate from her body, and he saw her eyes burn that sickening bright red as she smiled that silent, shaking smile. He fell backward into the patio, and when he opened his eyes, the severed arm in his grasp was just a broken piece of the cafe's wooden fence. When he finished telling us, the entire table went dead silent. The chill in the air suddenly felt a lot more malicious. Looking back at it now, as an adult, the sheer statistical impossibility of it all is what keeps me up at night. What are the odds that, out of hundreds of new cafes in Dalat, we randomly chose to walk into the exact one, built directly over that specific patch of dirt? What are the odds that the staff sat us at the very back, pushing Patrick to use a restroom position precisely over the drop-off, where he almost lost his mind 15 years ago? It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. It makes you realize how utterly powerless we are against the things that dwell in the dark. We paved over the dirt roads. We strung up pretty lights. We brought in hundreds of laughing tourists and played loud music, thinking we had civilized the wild, thinking we had chased the shadows away. But we didn't chase anything away. We just built a coffee shop on top of her hunting ground. She's still down there, clinging to the dirt in the pitch black, waiting with that dead, freezing hand. And honestly, the worst part is wondering what would have happened if Patrick hadn't let go of the branch. What if he had actually managed to pull her up into the light? My scalp was quite literally on fire. I can still vividly recall the exact sickening sensation of my hair follicles stretching to their absolute limit, feeling like entire clumps were about to be ripped cleanly from the skin of my head. The pain was so sharp, so blindingly intense, that it snapped me awake from a dead sleep, leaving me gasping for air in the freezing pitch-black darkness of my bedroom. I was drenched in this icy sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and as I desperately swung my legs over the edge of the mattress to run to my parents, my bare heel came down hard on something solid. It was this hollow, unforgiving thud of cheap plastic right under my foot, and when I looked down, my blood ran completely cold. Sitting perfectly upright on the floorboards, staring up at me in the dark, was the one thing I had buried at the very bottom of my toy bin days ago. Look, honestly, to make any sense of why a simple piece of plastic practically scarred me for life, I need to back up a bit and explain the weird dynamic of my family. I don't remember exactly what year it was that all of this started to unravel. Maybe I was 8 or 9, but I do know that my life was a massive contradiction. I grew up in Dalat, a mountain town in Vietnam that is perpetually wrapped in this bone-chilling, damp fog. It's a beautiful place if you're a tourist, but if you actually live on the outskirts, like in the Tremont area where my parents started out, it can feel incredibly isolating. And my parents, well, they didn't start out with money. Not even close. Before I was born, they were dirt poor, working as laborers on these sprawling, muddy coffee plantations on the hillsides. They had nothing. And during that time of extreme poverty, my mom got pregnant with her first child. She was maybe 5 or 6 months along, still working the fields because they literally couldn't afford for her to stop, when a heavy rainstorm hit. The red clay soil in Dalat turns into absolute ice when it's wet, and my mom slipped. She took a terrible fall, landing hard on her stomach, and she lost the baby. They were so broke that there was no proper funeral, no headstone, nothing like that. My dad just buried the remains in a small plot of dirt right in our backyard. They didn't even know if it was a boy or a girl at the time. It was just a heartbreaking, unspoken tragedy buried in the damp earth behind our kitchen window. But then, things started to change. By the time I was born, a few years later, my parents had started their own business, and through some crazy stroke of luck and relentless hard work, they started making money. And I don't just mean comfortable money. I mean they became obscenely wealthy. By the time I was in elementary school, they owned 4 or 5 properties right in the bustling center of Dalat. We moved out of the old, drafty house on the outskirts and into this massive, pristine home. And because my parents had suffered so much, and because they felt this immense, suffocating guilt about the child they couldn't protect, they spoiled me beyond belief. I was the golden child, the survivor. I was born into wealth, but my parents treated me like a princess to overcompensate for their past trauma. Whenever my dad traveled to Saigon for business, which is this massive, chaotic metropolis down south, he wouldn't just bring back a toy. He would bring back literal sacks of toys. I had these huge, waist-high plastic baskets in my room. 5 of them, I think, just overflowing with imported dolls, tea sets, stuffed animals, you name it. I had more crap than a toy store. Now, here is where the spiritual guilt comes into play. Shortly after I was born, my mom started having these vivid, recurring dreams. She dreamt of a little girl, maybe 2 or 3 years old, standing naked and shivering in front of our house, pointing at me and telling my mom that she wanted to wear pretty dresses like mine. My mom woke up from these dreams completely shaken, realizing that the baby she lost was a girl. So, with their new wealth, my parents went back to the old property, dug up the dirt mound, and built this elaborate, polished granite tomb. They didn't have a date of birth or death, so they just carved a name on it. We called her Sister Hai. In Vietnamese culture, Hai literally translates to the number 2. It's this incredibly strict old-school tradition we have, where the parents are considered the absolute number 1 of the household, meaning the very first child born is always given the title of number 2. So, by carving that into the stone, my parents weren't just giving her an identity. They were officially, permanently cementing a dead fetus as the eldest child, the undeniable head of the siblings. And the totally messed up part about that? It automatically made me, the living, breathing, surviving child, number 3. I was officially the younger sibling to a ghost. I was forced to carry this heavy, unspoken subservience to a mound of dirt in the backyard. Anyway, my mom, being deeply superstitious and incredibly grateful for her new fortune, firmly believed that Sister Hai's spirit was the guardian angel that brought our family wealth. So, she developed this bizarre ritual. Every time my dad brought home a mountain of new toys for me, my mom would pick out 1 or 2. But here's the messed up part. She would purposely pick the ugliest, cheapest looking toys out of the bunch. Because she knew I was a spoiled brat who didn't like sharing, she would take the toy I wouldn't miss, and she would drive out to the old house, walk out to the granite tomb, and leave them on the cold stone as an offering for Sister Hai. These toys would just sit out there in the harsh Dalat weather. They'd get rained on, baked in the sun, covered in mud and pine needles, until they were so degraded and gross that my mom would finally throw them in the trash a month or 2 later. And for years, I never cared. I had my premium, pristine toys in my warm room. I didn't give a damn about the cheap plastic junk sitting on a grave. Until one rainy afternoon. I was going through this phase where I was just bored with everything. I had been digging through my 5 overflowing baskets, tossing aside expensive dolls and plushies, complaining to myself that I had absolutely nothing fun to play with. You know how insufferable kids can be when they have too much. Anyway, my parents had taken me to visit the old property that day to do some cleaning, and while I was wandering around the backyard, I glanced over at the granite tomb. Sitting right there on the ledge was a doll my mom had placed there maybe a week prior. It was this rigid, stiff plastic thing, maybe 8 inches tall, with this horribly painted-on face and cheap, synthetic blonde hair that was already getting matted from the morning dew. It was still partially wrapped in its clear plastic packaging. It was objectively garbage compared to what I owned, but the boredom and the weird, forbidden nature of it just took over my stupid little brain. I looked around to make sure my mom was busy inside, and I quietly tiptoed over to the grave. The air around the stone was noticeably colder, carrying this heavy scent of wet dirt and decaying leaves. But I just snatched the doll right off the granite, shoved it under my jacket, and snuck it into the car. When we got back to our main house, I took it up to my room and ripped the packaging off. I played with it for maybe 45 minutes, and just as I expected, it was boring. The arms didn't bend right, the plastic felt greasy, and the painted eyes had this uneven, slightly crossed look that just made me uncomfortable. Feeling totally underwhelmed, I tossed it casually into one of my baskets and went downstairs to watch TV, completely forgetting about it. That was the absolute worst mistake of my entire life. About 3 days later, the weirdness started. I was brushing my teeth before school, my mouth full of minty foam, when my mom stormed into the bathroom, looking absolutely pissed. She was holding that cheap, ugly doll by its synthetic hair, waving it in my face, and she just started tearing into me. She demanded to know why I couldn't keep my messes confined to my own room, asking what possessed me to drag this ugly piece of junk into her and my dad's master bedroom and leave it sitting dead center on their pillows. I just stood there, spitting out toothpaste, totally bewildered. I tried to defend myself, mumbling that I hadn't touched the doll since the day I brought it home, let alone carried it into her room. But she just rolled her eyes, tossed the doll into my sink, and told me to clean up my act. I was so confused. I literally rationalized it away instantly, convincing myself that I must have absent-mindedly carried it in there while looking for my mom the night before. I dried the doll off, walked back to my room, and threw it back into the nearest basket. But 2 mornings later, it happened again. This time, my mom didn't even bring the doll to me. She just yelled from down the hall, complaining that she almost tripped over my stupid toy on her way out of bed. The thing had been sitting right at the foot of her doorway, inside her room. Now, I was starting to feel this creeping sense of unease. Our rooms shared a wall, sure, but my parents always locked their door from the inside at night. There was absolutely no physical way I could have sleepwalked in there and dropped a toy. It was impossible. When I went in to retrieve it, the doll was just lying there on the carpet, its weird, crossed eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I was so incredibly frustrated and slightly spooked, but mostly just annoyed, that I was getting in trouble for something I wasn't doing. I grabbed the doll, marched back to my room, and decided I was done with it. I went to my deepest, largest toy basket. I shoved the doll all the way to the very bottom, pressing it against the plastic base. Then, I took handfuls of other toys, blocks, stuffed bears, heavy wooden puzzles, and just piled them aggressively on top of it, burying it completely. To be extra safe, I grabbed a second, smaller basket full of books and plopped it right on top of the first one, squashing everything down. It was literally trapped under 20 pounds of childhood crap. I turned my back to walk toward my desk, and I hadn't even taken 2 full steps before I heard it. It wasn't a slow tumble. It was a sudden, violent crash, as the heavy-top basket was forcefully shoved aside, hitting the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter, sending books and wooden blocks sliding across the room in every direction. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The baskets had toppled, and sitting perfectly on top of the spilled pile of toy, completely unburied and resting as if it had been gently placed there, was the doll. My breath hitched. My brain scrambled to find a logical excuse. Maybe the pile was top-heavy. Maybe the floor vibrated. Maybe gravity just did something weird. But seeing that plastic face resting on top of everything I had just used to bury it, it pissed me off. I wasn't terrified yet. I was just a bratty kid whose authority in her own room was being challenged by a piece of garbage. I stomped over, grabbed the doll by its rigid little torso, and aggressively started shoving it back down into the remaining pile of toys. I was forcing it down, grinding it against the hard plastic edges of the other toys, muttering under my breath about how it kept getting me in trouble. And that's when it happened. As I pushed down with all my weight, something bit me. It wasn't a scratch from a jagged edge. It was a sharp, localized, piercing puncture, exactly like a set of tiny, needle-like teeth sinking violently into the soft webbing of skin right between my thumb and index finger. The pain was so sudden and white-hot that I shrieked, violently jerking my hand back. I stumbled backward, tripping over a book, and when I looked at my hand, I felt the blood drain from my face. A perfect crescent-shaped chunk of flesh had been cleanly gouged out of the webbing of my hand. Dark red blood was welling up instantly, dripping thick and fast onto the hardwood floor, splattering in these sickening little drops. I started screaming bloody murder. My mom came rushing in, took one look at my hand, and went into full panic mode. She wrapped a towel tightly around my hand, dragged me to the car, and sped through the foggy streets of Dalat to the nearest hospital. The cut was deep enough that the doctor had to give me 2 tight, pulling stitches right there in the ER. It cost my parents a few $100,000 dong, maybe like 15 or 20 bucks, which is decent money for a hospital visit. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological horror waiting for me at home. When we finally got back, my hand heavily bandaged and throbbing with this dull, relentless ache, I just wanted to sleep. But as we walked into my room, my mom stopped dead in her tracks. The spilled toys were still everywhere, but my mom slowly bent down and picked up the doll from the pile. She turned it around, holding it under the harsh glare of the ceiling light, and she let out this shaky, confused breath. She muttered something about why the doll had red lipstick smeared all over its lower half. She brought it closer to her face, swiped her thumb across the doll's hard plastic mouth, and then she froze. I watched her bring her thumb to her nose, inhaling the scent, and her face went completely ashen. It smelled like raw iron. It smelled exactly like the blood that was currently soaked into the bandages on my hand. My mom looked from the doll's stained mouth to my bandaged hand, and I could physically see the horrifying realization click behind her eyes. She didn't say a word. She just set the doll down on my desk, her hands trembling slightly, and rushed me out of the room. That night, I forced my parents to let me sleep in their bed. I was terrified. The thought of that doll sitting in my room, its plastic mouth stained with my own blood, made my stomach tie itself into agonizing knots. But sleeping in my parents' room didn't save me from what was already attached to me. Somewhere in the dead of night, the temperature in the room plummeted. Dalat gets freezing at night, but this was an unnatural, suffocating cold that seemed to radiate from the floorboards upward. I was lying in the middle of the massive bed between my parents, buried under thick blankets, when the mattress behind my feet suddenly dipped. It wasn't a subtle shift. It felt exactly like the localized, concentrated weight of a small child crawling up onto the edge of the bed. I was completely paralyzed, trapped in that terrifying liminal space between waking and sleeping, my breath catching in my throat as I felt the weight slowly dragging itself up the blankets, moving closer and closer to my head. And then, a pair of freezing wet hands violently plunged into my hair. They grabbed massive fistfuls of my hair right at the roots, twisting the strands around their fingers, and yanked my head backward with a shocking, brutal amount of force. The pain exploded across my scalp. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were frozen solid. Through the darkness, hovering right over my face, I saw the silhouette of a little girl. She was maybe 5 or 6 years old, completely naked, her skin glistening with damp, dark soil, as if she had just clawed her way out of a muddy grave. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her voice echoed directly inside my skull. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was this wet, guttural, venomous hiss that vibrated with decades of resentment. "You take everything," she shrieked, violently jerking my head back again, making my neck crack. "I am dead, and you are alive, and you still take what is mine. Greedy. You are so fucking greedy." The sheer hatred radiating from her was suffocating. I thrashed wildly, my survival instincts finally breaking through the paralysis, and I shot up in bed, letting out a horrific, blood-curdling scream. I was drenched in sweat, my chest heaving, my scalp burning with actual, lingering physical pain. I scrambled out of bed, hyperventilating, blindly stepping down onto the floor, and that's when my heel came down on the hard plastic. I snapped the bedside lamp on, my hands shaking so violently I almost knocked the lamp over. And there it was, sitting upright on the floorboards, perfectly positioned right where my feet would land, was the doll. The door to my parents' room was locked from the inside. The key was still sitting on the dresser. I had left the doll on the desk in my bedroom down the hall. There was absolutely zero logical explanation for how it got inside, past a locked, solid wood door, to sit by my bed. I absolutely lost my mind. I screamed until my throat bled, waking my parents up in a sheer panic. When my mom saw the doll sitting there, the remaining color drained from her face. She finally broke down and dragged the truth out of me. When I tearfully confessed that I had stolen the doll from Sister High's granite tomb because I was bored with my own toys, my mom looked like she was going to faint. She didn't comfort me. Instead, driven by pure, unadulterated fear of the supernatural, she grabbed me by the arm and spanked me right there in the middle of the room. But it wasn't a disciplinary spanking. It was loud, theatrical, and she was crying while she did it. She was screaming out into the empty room, loudly proclaiming to the walls that she was punishing me, that I was just a foolish, ungrateful child, and begging Sister High to forgive me and to please stop terrorizing the family. It was the most desperate, pathetic display of a mother trying to negotiate with a vengeful spirit I have ever seen. The next morning, the doll was gone. My dad took it, drove it far out into the woods outside the city, and burned it. After that, the dynamic in our house shifted permanently. My parents stopped buying cheap offerings. From that day forward, whenever they bought me a toy, they would buy an identical, equally expensive toy, the exact same brand, the exact same quality, and they would take it out to the granite tomb. I would watch from the window as gorgeous, imported porcelain dolls and intricate electronic toys were set on the cold stone, left to rot in the sun and the rain. Hundreds of dollars worth of beautiful things, slowly degrading into muddy, waterlogged garbage over the months, all to appease a 5-year-old ghost trapped in a cycle of endless envy. I am in my 30s now, and honestly, the trauma of that week never left me. Looking back, the most terrifying part isn't the ghost story itself. It's the realization of what my sister's existence actually is. She isn't in some peaceful afterlife. She is permanently tethered to that patch of dirt in daylight, frozen in the mental state of a jealous, neglected child watching her younger sibling get everything she was denied. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment and I hear a faint scratching sound, or if I see a piece of plastic catching the light in the corner of my eye, my heart still stops. I instinctively rub the faint, crescent-shaped scar between my thumb and index finger. The physical wound healed decades ago, but the psychological rot is still there, because I know, with absolute certainty, that if I ever take something I'm not supposed to, she will find a way into my locked room to take it back. I need to warn you right up front before I even get into this. What I'm about to tell you is incredibly messed up, and if you have triggers regarding childhood trauma or, inappropriate things involving kids, you might want to click off right now. I'm sharing this anonymously because I'm 21 now, but this happened back in 2012 when I was just 7 years old, and honestly, it's a stain on my soul that I still haven't been able to wash off. I've debated telling this for years, but I need to get it out of my head. I need to know if anyone else out there has had their entire life derailed by a ghost that didn't just haunt a house, but actually violated them. So, back in 2011, my family had a pretty comfortable life. My parents owned a nice house, had decent savings, and we had even moved my grandpa in with us so we could take care of him in his old age. He was in his late 70s, super frail, walked with this heavy wooden cane, and he was the sweetest man you could ever imagine. He used to bathe me when I was a toddler, feed me, watch cartoons with me. He was my safe space. But then, within the span of like 3 or 4 months, everything just collapsed. My parents hit some catastrophic financial ruin. I still don't know the full details, but we lost everything. The house, the business, tens of thousands of dollars just wiped out. We had creditors breathing down our necks, and I remember this one night, my parents just snapped. They packed whatever clothes they could fit into garbage bags, strapped me and my grandpa onto the backs of 2 motorbikes, and we fled in the dead of night. We drove for hours through the dark until we ended up in Bin Duong, this densely packed industrial province where the air always tastes like factory exhaust, and the alleyways are so cramped the sun barely hits the ground. We were essentially hiding. We stayed in a sketchy motel for a few days, but no landlord wanted to rent to a broke couple with a little kid and a sick, elderly man who looked like he might pass away on their property. Finally, out of pure desperation, my dad found this dirt-cheap house deep inside a labyrinth of a slum. The alley leading up to it was constantly flooded with this foul, stagnant water that smelled like raw sewage and rust, and you had to wade through ankle-deep muck just to get to the front door. The house itself was what they call a tube house over there. It was suffocatingly narrow, maybe 10 feet wide at most, but it stretched back incredibly far, like a dark concrete tunnel. You walked into the living room, then there was a long, unlit hallway that squeezed past my grandpa's room, then my parents' room, and all the way at the very back of this lightless corridor was the kitchen and a tiny, grimy bathroom. Because we had no proper documents and were hiding from debt collectors, my parents couldn't enroll me in the local school. so I had to drop out for an entire year. My parents immediately got jobs as factory line workers, pulling brutal shifts from 6 in the morning until 10 at night just to put a few bucks on the table. That left me entirely alone in that dark, depressing tunnel of a house with my grandpa all day, every day. For the first few days it was fine, but I was always a skittish kid, and that house, it just had this heavy, sickening energy. By 6 or 7 in the evening, the shadows in that long hallway seemed to stretch and swallow the light. Because I was so small, I couldn't reach the light switches, which were these weird, high-up pull cords, so whenever I had to use the bathroom at night, I would beg my grandpa to walk down that dark hallway with me. One evening, my grandpa and I were sitting in the living room watching some old cartoons on a scratched-up DVD. I had to pee really bad, so I nudged him and asked him to take me back there. He tried to stand up, but his joints were completely shot that day. I remember him groaning, grabbing his knee, and just collapsing back into his chair, apologizing and telling me I'd have to be a big girl and go by myself because his arthritis was flaring up too badly. I was annoyed, but mostly I was just a kid who didn't want to miss the cartoon. I had been holding it in for so long that I was doing the little potty dance, so I just bolted down that pitch-black hallway by myself. I didn't even bother turning on the bathroom light or closing the door. I just wanted to be fast. While I was sitting there in the dark bathroom, I suddenly heard this rapid, heavy thudding sound vibrating through the thin floorboards, echoing from the front of the house and moving incredibly fast toward the kitchen. It was this aggressive, stomping rhythm that made my stomach do a nervous little flip, because my parents weren't due home for hours, and there was absolutely no way my crippled grandfather could move like that. I quickly pulled my pants up and peeked out of the bathroom into the adjoining kitchen. Sitting right there at the small dining table, completely shrouded in the shadows, was my grandpa, but he didn't have his cane. He was sitting perfectly upright, perfectly still, just staring at me. And he was smiling, but it wasn't his warm, wrinkly smile. It was this wide, tight, grotesque grin, and he kept slowly licking his lips over and over again, like he was looking at a piece of meat. My 7-year-old brain immediately started making excuses to protect me from the fear. I told myself he was just playing a game, that he had somehow pushed through the pain to come check on me so I wouldn't be scared in the dark, because he was my grandpa, right? He used to give me baths. I had been naked around him 1,000,000 times as a toddler. There was no concept of danger in my mind regarding this man. I walked up to him and grabbed his arm, telling him I was done and that we should go back to the TV. As soon as I spoke, he reached out with his left hand and placed it right on my lower stomach, his fingers brushing against my upper thigh. I froze. It felt wrong. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt freezing cold, but my brain was still desperately trying to gaslight itself. I nervously laughed and tried to gently push his heavy hand away, complaining that he was playing too rough, and it kind of hurt. He didn't say a word. The smile just dropped off his face, replaced by this dead, hollow stare, and then he shoved his hand forcefully down my shorts. A sharp jolt of pain shot through me, and I violently ripped myself away from him, stumbling backward. I was incredibly confused and suddenly terrified, pulling my waistband up tight as I scrambled all the way back to the living room. I curled up into a tight ball on the sofa, hugging my knees to my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs. I kept asking myself why he was acting so mean, why he would do something that hurt me. About 5 minutes later, I heard this slow, agonizing shuffling coming from the hallway. It was my grandpa, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, dragging his feet, panting from exhaustion as he finally made it to the living room. He looked at me with total bewilderment and asked how he had ended up in the kitchen, complaining that he must have fallen asleep and sleepwalked because his legs were killing him. He then kindly asked if I had managed to go pee all by myself. He was completely back to normal. His voice, his posture, his eyes, everything was my sweet old Pop again. I just sat there, paralyzed in confusion, nodding slowly as he sat down next to me and happily went back to watching the cartoon. I didn't say a word. I just kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, my brain completely incapable of processing that the vile, fast-moving man in the kitchen and this frail, loving old man sitting beside me were somehow occupying the same body. When my parents finally got home exhausted and covered in factory grease. I tried to tell my mom. I pulled her aside and quietly mentioned that Grandpa had touched me down there and that it hurt. But my parents were completely broken by their financial stress. They were surviving on fumes. My mom just let out this exhausted sigh, brushed my hair out of my face, and rationalized it away, telling me that Grandpa loved me and was probably just tickling me, begging me not to make a fuss because they were just too tired to deal with drama. I felt so stupid, so I just shut my mouth and went to bed. That night, my mom and I were sleeping on a mattress on the floor in the middle room. I don't know what time it was, maybe 3:14 a.m. or something, but the air in the room suddenly grew so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. I opened my eyes in the dark, and the bedroom door slowly creaked open. A tall silhouette stepped inside. It was him, but he was standing completely straight, moving with this fluid, terrifying grace. He walked over to my side of the mattress and slowly crouched down. I was wide awake, but I literally could not move a single muscle. It was like an invisible weight was crushing my chest, pinning me to the bed. He reached under the thin blanket and wrapped his cold, calloused fingers around my ankle. He began stroking it, slowly sliding his hand up my calf, over my knee, and resting it on my inner thigh. I was screaming inside my head, crying silently, but my vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He kept his hand there, applying a sickening amount of pressure, right up until my mom shifted in her sleep beside me. The moment she moved, he sharply yanked his hand back, stood straight up, and silently glided out of the room. I spent the rest of the night crying softly into my pillow, absolutely terrified of the man I loved most in the world. The next day, it was like nothing had happened. He cooked lunch. He limped around on his cane. He bought me a little piece of candy from a passing street vendor. My childish brain happily accepted this piece, eager to forget the nightmares of the past 2 days. But then the sun went down. We were sitting in the living room, watching another DVD. He was sitting on a plastic chair about 3 feet away from me. I was wearing these loose little kid shorts, just sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in the movie. Slowly, without making a sound, I noticed out of my peripheral vision that his chair had moved closer. Then, a few minutes later, it moved closer again. Suddenly, I felt a heavy hand slam down onto my bare thigh. I ripped my eyes away from the TV and looked at him. His face was entirely transformed again. It was that exact same vile, lecherous expression from the kitchen. He was panting slightly, staring down at me, drool literally pooling at the corner of his mouth. I tried to scramble backward, but that exact same paralysis from the night before washed over me. I was trapped in my own body. He started aggressively rubbing my thigh, sliding his hand higher and higher. I looked down, absolutely sick to my stomach, and I saw that his other hand was shoved deep inside his own pants, moving in this frantic, disgusting rhythm. "You're such a pretty little thing." The voice that came out of his throat wasn't his. It was raspy, deeper, filled with this nauseating malice. I couldn't scream. All I could do was weakly whimper, begging him to stop, telling him he was hurting me. But every time I pleaded, his grip only tightened, his hand forcing its way under my clothes, tearing at my skin. I was just staring at the flickering blue light of the TV screen, hyper-fixating on the static, trying to detach my brain from the physical agony and the sheer fucking terror of what my own grandfather was doing to me. Right at that exact second, the most violent, explosive banging erupted on the metal front door. "Hey! You home? I brought some fruit," a female neighbor hollered from outside. The loud noise shattered the air, and my grandfather's entire body violently convulsed. It was like a massive electrical shock ripped through his spine. He seized up, his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he collapsed sideways, hitting the concrete floor with a sickening crack as he fainted completely dead away. The invisible weight holding me down instantly vanished. I scrambled up, crying hysterically, yanking my clothes straight, and I threw open the front door. I practically tackled the neighbor lady, sobbing into her stomach that my grandpa had hurt me. She looked down, and her face went completely pale. She saw blood dripping down my inner thigh, Sigh. Look, I don't even want to say the actual words out loud. I physically can't. It makes me sick to my stomach. But I know you guys understand what that blood meant. It wasn't just some inappropriate touch. That thing inside him took something away from a 7-year-old girl that she shouldn't even know exists. She grabbed me, screaming for help, and pulled me to her own rental unit a few doors down, locking us inside. She cleaned me up, crying with me, absolutely furious, ready to call the police. About 10 minutes later, there was a weak, pathetic knock on her door. It was my grandpa. He was leaning heavily on his cane, looking absolutely lost, calling out my name with tears in his eyes, asking where I had gone. The neighbor tore the door open and started screaming at him, calling him a monster, threatening to have him locked up for the rest of his miserable life for what he did to a child. My grandpa just stood there, looking at his hands, which were smeared with my blood. He dropped his cane and fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, swearing to God he didn't remember anything, begging to die right there on the spot, because he couldn't comprehend how he could have done something so evil. When my parents rushed home, all hell broke loose. But my grandfather, despite the universal hatred radiating toward him, couldn't accept that he had done it. He knew his own heart. The very next morning, despite his aching joints, he hobbled around the slum, asking the oldest residents about our specific rental house, lying and saying he had seen a shadow to get them talking. And that's when the horrific truth came out. Just 3 months before we moved in, that house had been occupied by a 40-year-old man who ran a small grocery out of the living room. He had been babysitting his young niece, a little girl exactly my age. He had been assaulting her for weeks. One afternoon, a customer walked in unannounced and caught him actively doing it. The customer dragged him out into the alley and screamed for the neighborhood. A mob formed in seconds. Vigilante justice in those slums is brutal and absolute. The neighbors beat that man with pipes and bricks until he stopped breathing, right there in the flooded alley. Because it was a mob, no one was charged. His family fled, the house sat empty, and the landlord immediately rented it out to the next desperate family that came along, which was us. That sick, twisted entity hadn't moved on. It was still rotting inside that narrow tube house, and it found the weakest, most vulnerable vessel it could easily overpower, my frail, elderly grandfather. When my parents found out, they didn't even pack. We abandoned the house that very afternoon. We didn't burn incense, we didn't pray for the spirit to find peace. You don't pray for a monster like that. We just ran, but escaping the house didn't fix anything. My grandfather lived for 3 more years before his body finally gave out, and for those entire 3 years, I couldn't look at him. Logically, I knew he was possessed. I knew it wasn't his soul that touched me, but my trauma didn't care about logic. The hands that violated me were physically his. The disgusting face that haunted my nightmares wore his wrinkles. Whenever we were in our new, safe apartment, I locked my bedroom door. If he walked into the kitchen, I would immediately walk out. I treated him like he was a disease. And the most heartbreaking part is, he understood. He never pushed me. He would just quietly bring me a glass of water, set it on the table from a distance, and limp away. His head hung low in perpetual shame for a sin he didn't even commit. He died carrying that heavy, awkward silence between us. And now, as an adult, the guilt of freezing out an innocent old man eats me alive every single day. But the physical trauma is worse. Even now, married to a man I love with all my heart, intimacy is a battlefield. Half the time, the moment things get physical, my brain forcefully flashes back to the flickering light of that old TV, the smell of factory exhaust, and the feeling of cold, calloused fingers digging into my skin. I just completely break down crying, leaving my poor husband confused while I suffocate in a memory that technically wasn't even caused by a living human being. I guess I'm just putting this out there because I feel so utterly isolated. Has anyone else ever been collateral damage to a haunting like this? Has anyone else had a spiritual entity physically rob them of their ability to trust, to be intimate, to feel clean? Because the ghosts in the movies just want to scare you. They just want to make you jump. But the thing in that house, it wanted to ruin me. And honestly, I think it succeeded. I'm sorry if this was a hard listen. I really am. I had to get it out. Please, wherever you are living, whatever cheap place you're renting to get by, look into its history. Because sometimes, the worst monsters don't leave when their heart stops beating. Stay safe out there.